Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m., cutting through the suffocating quiet of our patrol car. Dispatch's voice carried that particular tone, the one that meant another sleepless night was about to get worse. Unit 23, welfare check requested at 1247 Elm Street. Neighbor reports no activity for 3 days. Unusual smell. I glanced at Rodriguez, my partner of 8 months, whose jaw was already tight with the kind of tension that comes from too many of these calls. We'd both learned that welfare checks after midnight rarely ended well. The living don't usually require checking on. The drive through the residential neighborhood felt longer than it should have. Street lamps cast sickly yellow pools of light that seemed to dissolve rather than illuminate, leaving everything beyond their reach swimming in an impenetrable darkness. Houses sat like sleeping giants, their windows black and lifeless. Even the familiar hum of the engine sounded different tonight, strained, almost reluctant. 1247. Elm Street hunched between two well-maintained properties like a rotten tooth. Paint peeled from its siding in long, curling strips that reminded me of shed skin. The lawn had surrendered to weeds weeks ago, maybe months. A newspaper, yellowed and bloated with moisture, lay abandoned on the front steps. The smell hit us before we'd even killed the engine, sweet and cloying, with an undertone that made my stomach turn. Rodriguez pressed his sleeve against his nose as we approached the front door. The porch light flickered erratically, casting our shadows in a nauseating dance against the warped boards beneath our feet. Each step creaked with a sound like breaking bones. I knocked first, 3 sharp raps that echoed too loudly in the stillness. When no answer came, I tried again, harder this time, calling out our identification. The silence that followed felt deliberate, almost mocking. Rodriguez circled to check the back while I tested the front door. The handle turned easily, too easily. The lock had been left undone, which should have been reassuring but somehow felt ominous instead. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to emanate from the house itself. The smell intensified as we crossed the threshold, wrapping around us like a living thing. Our flashlight beams revealed a living room frozen in time, magazines scattered across a coffee table, a half-empty cup of tea gone cold and moldy, a television that stared back at us with its blank dead screen. Dust motes danced in our lights like tiny spirits disturbed from their rest. The floorboards beneath our feet protested every step, their groans harmonizing with the settling sounds of the old house. Somewhere in the walls, pipes ticked and whispered secrets we couldn't understand. The air itself felt thick, almost breathable, as if the house had been holding its breath for days. We found her in the bedroom. The elderly woman lay in her bed, covers pulled up to her chin with an almost ceremonial precision. Her white hair spread across the pillow like spilled milk, and her skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that made the veins beneath visible as dark rivers. Her eyes were closed, her mouth slightly open. Everything about the scene suggested peaceful passing. Everything except the wrongness that crawled up my spine like ice water. Rodriguez stepped closer, his flashlight beam steady on her face. I remained in the doorway, fighting an inexplicable urge to flee. There was something about the way she lay there, something that didn't quite fit the narrative of natural death we were constructing. That's when I noticed her fingers. They rested atop the covers, but they weren't quite still. Not moving exactly, but there was a quality to their positioning that suggested recent motion, as if they'd just finished grasping at something we couldn't see. The nail beds were darkened, not with decay but with something else, something that looked almost like soil. Rodriguez leaned in to check for a pulse, his hand hovering over her wrist. The moment his fingers made contact, her eyes snapped open, not gradually, not the slow flutter of someone awakening. They opened all at once, wide and white and completely without iris or pupil, just endless, milky expanses that reflected our flashlight beams like twin moons. Her mouth opened too, releasing a sound that wasn't quite a moan, wasn't quite a whisper. but something in between that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rodriguez jerked backward so violently he crashed into the wall behind him. I stumbled over my own feet trying to back out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The flashlight beam wavered wildly, sending shadows careening across the ceiling like panicked birds. But she wasn't moving. Not really. Her body remained in the same position, covers undisturbed, that ceremonial arrangement intact. Only her eyes tracked our movement with an awareness that felt both ancient and hungry. Her mouth worked soundlessly now, as if she were trying to speak but had forgotten how words functioned. The rational part of my brain, the part trained to assess situations and respond appropriately, kicked in with explanations, muscle spasms, post-mortem reflexes, medical conditions that could cause such phenomena. But the primitive part, the part that had kept humans alive through millennia of darkness, was screaming warnings I couldn't ignore. We called for an ambulance from outside the house, neither of us willing to remain in that bedroom any longer than necessary. Rodriguez's voice shook as he gave our location and situation to dispatch. I found myself scanning the windows of the house, watching for movement that logic told me wouldn't come. The paramedics arrived 18 minutes later. I know because I counted every second. They entered the house with the confidence of professionals who'd seen everything the human body could do in its final stages. When they emerged 20 minutes after that, their expressions had changed. The crew chief found us standing by our patrol car, still too wired to sit. He pulled off his gloves with deliberate movements, his eyes not quite meeting ours. "Stroke," he said simply. "Recent one. Probably happened sometime yesterday. She's alive, but barely. We're transporting her now." Rodriguez nodded, but I caught something in the paramedic's tone, a careful neutrality that suggested there was more he wasn't saying. I watched as they wheeled her out on the gurney. The sheet covered her completely now, but as they loaded her into the ambulance, I could have sworn I saw movement beneath the fabric. Small, rhythmic motions that reminded me of breathing, or perhaps something else entirely. The call should have ended there. We filed our report, cleared the scene, and returned to patrol. But as the days passed, the incident refused to settle into the neat category of unusual but explainable. Details that should have faded instead sharpened in my memory, taking on significance I couldn't rationalize away. The way her eyes had opened, not like someone regaining consciousness, but like something that had been watching us all along, finally deciding to reveal itself. The sound she'd made, was it really a moan, or had it been something more deliberate? Something that might have been words in a language I didn't recognize. I started having dreams about that house. In them, I would return alone, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The front door would be open, waiting. Inside, the house would be exactly as we'd left it, except for the bedroom. The bed would be empty, covers thrown back in haste, and muddy footprints would lead from where she'd lain to the window, which would be open, screen torn, as if something had pushed through from the inside. Rodriguez noticed my distraction during shifts. He'd ask if I was all right, and I'd nod and deflect, but I could see the concern growing in his eyes. How could I explain that I'd started checking obituaries compulsively, looking for news of an elderly woman who died in the hospital? How could I tell him that when I found no such notice, relief and terror battled for dominance in my chest? 2 weeks after the call, I drove past 1247 Elm Street during my off hours. I told myself it was idle curiosity, but my hands were shaking as I turned onto the street. The house looked exactly the same, abandoned, deteriorating, windows dark. But the front door was open. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, engine running, telling myself to drive away. The rational explanations lined up neatly. Someone from the family had come to clean out the house. Real estate agents were showing the property. Squatters had taken up residence. Simple, logical possibilities that explained everything. But none of them explained the figure I glimpsed moving past one of the upstairs windows. It was too quick for me to make out details, just a pale shape that seemed to flow rather than walk. My eyes could have been playing tricks, shadows, reflections, optical illusions born from stress and sleepless nights. Yet even as I cataloged these possibilities, my foot found the accelerator, and I drove away faster than the speed limit technically allowed. That night, sleep brought no relief. In my dreams, the house called to me with a voice that sounded like wind through dried leaves. I saw myself walking up those rotting porch steps, pushing open that door, climbing the stairs toward whatever waited in the darkness above, and always, just before I reached the top step, I would hear it. That sound she'd made in the bedroom, but clearer now, recognizable. She was calling my name. I woke with the certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the world, some barrier between the possible and impossible, worn thin by repetition and attention. The logical mind that had served me through 8 years of police work insisted this was trauma response, stress manifestation, the brain's attempt to process an unusual but ultimately mundane experience. But in the small hours before dawn, logic felt fragile as tissue paper. 3 nights later, dispatch sent us back to Elm Street. Different house this time, 1251, 4 doors down. Noise complaint from neighbors who reported hearing someone moving around in what they knew to be an empty property. The complainant had been specific. Footsteps in the upstairs rooms, going back and forth, like someone pacing. As we pulled up to the address, my eyes found 1247 automatically. The house sat in its familiar decay, but something was different. The upstairs windows, which had been dark during my previous drive-by, now showed a faint, flickering light. Not electric, but something warmer and more unsteady. Candlelight, perhaps, or a flashlight with dying batteries. Rodriguez was already out of the car, heading toward 1251. I forced myself to follow, though every instinct screamed at me to keep my back to the street, to not turn my eyes away from that impossible light. The investigation at 1251 turned up nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of occupancy, no explanation for the sounds that had prompted the call. But as we returned to our patrol car, I heard it clearly in the stillness of the night. Footsteps from the direction of 1247. Slow, deliberate steps across wooden floors. Steps that paused, as if the walker had stopped to look out a window. Steps that resumed with what sounded unmistakably like purpose. Rodriguez heard them too. I saw it in the way his hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, in the quick glance he shot toward the source of the sound. But when I started walking toward 1247, he caught my arm. "Don't," he said quietly. "Whatever's happening there, it's not our call." He was right, of course. We had no legal authority to investigate, no reasonable suspicion to justify entry. Whatever was occurring in that house existed in the gray area between police work and something else entirely. Something that uniforms and badges and rational procedure weren't equipped to handle. I let him guide me back to the car, but I didn't stop listening. The footsteps continued as we drove away, and in my peripheral vision I caught glimpses of movement in those upstairs windows. Shadows that moved against the light with a rhythm that matched the sounds we could hear. For the next week, I avoided Elm Street entirely. I changed my route to work, declined patrol assignments in that sector, even took a different path home from the grocery store. If something was happening at 1247, and my rational mind still insisted there might be perfectly logical explanations, then it wasn't my responsibility to investigate. But the dreams wouldn't stop. Each night brought variations on the same theme. Returning to that house, climbing those stairs, finding something waiting that wore the face of the elderly woman but wasn't her. Not anymore. In the dreams, she spoke to me in that sound that wasn't quite speech, and somehow I understood what she was trying to communicate. She was grateful. Grateful that we'd found her. Grateful that we'd been there when she'd opened her eyes. Grateful for the opportunity to show us what she'd become. The dreams always ended the same way, with the understanding that gratitude required reciprocation, that something had been offered and something was expected in return. A visit, a conversation, an acknowledgement of the bond forged in that moment when her eyes had opened and found ours watching. I began to research stroke symptoms, medical explanations for the phenomena we'd witnessed. The information I found was both reassuring and disturbing. Stroke patients could indeed exhibit unusual behaviors, confusion, disorientation, even apparent supernatural manifestations that had logical neurological explanations. But none of the literature addressed cases where the patient exhibited awareness and intent, that seemed to transcend their physical condition. More troubling were the gaps in my research. Hospital records that should have existed but didn't. Ambulance reports that had been filed but couldn't be located. Even Rodriguez, when I tried to discuss the incident, seemed to remember details differently than I did. Not dramatically, just small discrepancies that undermined my confidence in my own recollections. Had her eyes really been completely white? Or was that a trick of flashlight illumination? Had the sound she made actually resembled speech? Or was my memory unconsciously editing the experience to make it more significant? The uncertainty was almost worse than the certainty of supernatural encounter would have been. On the 15th night after the original call, I woke to find myself dressed and standing by my front door, car keys in my hand. I had no memory of getting out of bed, no conscious decision to prepare for a journey, but my body had made a choice my mind hadn't authorized. The drive to Elm Street happened in a fog of automatism. I was aware of turning the key, of the engine starting, of streetlights passing overhead, but it all felt distant and unreal. Only when I parked across from 1247 did full consciousness return, along with the terrifying understanding that I hadn't driven there alone. The presence was subtle but unmistakable, a sense of companionship, of shared purpose, that made the car feel crowded despite my solitary occupancy. It wasn't malevolent, which somehow made it more unnerving. It felt familiar, like something that had been with me for weeks, growing stronger, more defined, waiting for me to notice. The house waited too. Every window was dark now, but the darkness felt active rather than empty. Behind that blackness, something was aware of my arrival, something that had been expecting me. I sat in the car for an hour, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations for my presence there: sleepwalking, stress response, subconscious fascination with an unusual case. But those explanations felt hollow, inadequate to explain the sense of anticipation that filled the air like humidity before a storm. When I finally drove home, I carried the certainty that I would return, not might return, would return. The decision had been made by something deeper than conscious choice, and resistance would only delay the inevitable. The next morning brought news that should have ended everything. Rodriguez mentioned, almost casually, that he'd heard the elderly woman from the welfare check had recovered more fully than expected. The stroke damage had been less severe than initially assessed, and she'd been transferred to a rehabilitation facility. She would live. I should have felt relief. Instead, the news filled me with a dread so profound it was almost nauseating. If she was alive and recovering, then what had I been sensing? What had been calling to me in dreams? What presence had ridden with me to Elm Street in the early hours of morning? That night, I didn't dream at all. For the first time in weeks, sleep brought complete darkness and silence. But when I woke, I found a note on my nightstand, written in my own handwriting but containing words I didn't remember forming. She remembers you too. I stared at the note for 20 minutes, searching my memory for any trace of writing it. Nothing. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. I recognized the particular way I formed the letter R, the slight rightward slant that had been consistent since childhood. But the act of creating it had been entirely erased from my consciousness. The implications were too vast and terrible to fully contemplate. If I was writing notes with no memory of doing so, what else might I be doing? Where might I be going? What conversations might I be having with things that shouldn't exist? I called in sick that day and drove to the rehabilitation facility. I told myself I was seeking closure, confirmation that the woman was indeed alive and well, proof that my experiences had rational explanations. But as I walked through the sterile hallways, following signs toward the stroke recovery wing, I knew I was lying to myself. I found her in room 237, sitting by a window that looked out onto a small garden. The afternoon light fell across her face, revealing features that were simultaneously familiar and foreign. She looked older than she had in the bedroom, more fragile, but there was an alertness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, an awareness that seemed to extend beyond her immediate surroundings. When she saw me in the doorway, Her face broke into a smile that was both warm and terrible. "Officer," she said, and her voice was exactly as I'd imagined it would be. "I was wondering when you'd come to visit." The conversation that followed exists in my memory like a half-remembered dream. We spoke. I'm certain of that. She thanked me for finding her, explained that the stroke had been a gateway rather than an injury, described experiences during her unconsciousness that shouldn't have been possible. But the specific words, the exact details, slip away whenever I try to focus on them. What remains is the understanding we reached, the acknowledgement of connection, the agreement that some bonds, once formed, cannot be severed by mere physical separation or rational dismissal. When I left the facility, I carried with me the certainty that the woman in room 237 was exactly who she appeared to be. A stroke survivor, recovering steadily, grateful for the intervention that had saved her life. I also carried the equally certain knowledge that she was something else entirely. Something that had noticed our presence that night, remembered our faces, and chosen to maintain contact across whatever void separates the living from the something else. The contradiction should have driven me to madness. Instead, it brought a strange peace. There are things in the world that exist beyond the boundaries of rational explanation, and acknowledging them doesn't require understanding them. Some experiences demand acceptance rather than analysis. I still patrol the streets, still respond to calls, still file reports in neat logical language. But now I know that the world contains spaces where logic becomes optional, where the impossible and the everyday coexist without contradiction. I know because I've stood in those spaces, looked into eyes that shouldn't have opened, and heard gratitude expressed in sounds that weren't quite words. And sometimes, late at night when the radio is quiet and the streets are empty, I think about room 237 and wonder if she's looking out her window, watching for familiar faces in the darkness. Sometimes I wonder if she's still there at all, or if what I visited was something else wearing the shape of recovery and normalcy. But mostly, I try not to wonder anything at all. Some questions are too dangerous to ask, and some answers change you in ways that can't be undone. The world is stranger than we allow ourselves to believe, and sometimes that strangeness notices us noticing it. When that happens, the best you can hope for is that it finds you interesting rather than threatening. I think I was very, very lucky. Or perhaps luck had nothing to do with it at all. Story 2. The realtor's key felt heavier than it should have as I turned it in the ornate brass lock. The house on Elm Street had been empty for 3 years, and the musty smell that greeted me spoke of neglect and secrets kept in darkness. Built in 1923, the Victorian structure stood like a weathered sentinel among the newer homes, its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of too many seasons. I'd come to appraise the property for the bank, a routine evaluation that should have taken 2 hours at most. The morning sun filtered through grimy windows, casting fractured patterns across hardwood floors that creaked with each step. Dust motes danced in the amber light like tiny spirits, and I found myself holding my breath more often than necessary. The front parlor retained hints of its former grandeur. Faded wallpaper bore the ghost patterns of long-removed paintings, and the mantelpiece still held the outline where a clock had once ticked away the hours. I pulled out my measuring tape and clipboard, forcing myself to focus on the mundane task of documentation. Square footage, structural integrity, marketability. These were solid, quantifiable things that couldn't deceive or mislead, but the house seemed to resist my attempts at clinical assessment. As I moved from room to room, I became increasingly aware of the sounds the old structure made. Not just the expected settling and groaning of aged timber, but subtler noises that seemed to follow just at the edge of hearing. Soft scratching that could have been mice in the walls, or the whisper of fabric against wood. Occasional taps that might have been pipes expanding, or fingers drumming against glass. The kitchen retained an ancient gas stove and a porcelain sink stained brown with mineral deposits. Cabinet doors hung askew on corroded hinges, revealing shelves lined with yellowed newspaper from decades past. I bent to examine the flooring and noticed something peculiar. Scuff marks that formed an almost perfect circle in the center of the room. The marks were old, worn deep into the wood, as if something had been dragged around and around in an endless loop. I found myself lingering longer than necessary in each room, reluctant to move deeper into the house. The rational part of my mind attributed this hesitation to the oppressive atmosphere of abandonment, but a deeper instinct whispered warnings I couldn't quite articulate. The air felt thick, almost viscous, and I had the persistent sensation of being observed from just beyond my peripheral vision. The staircase to the second floor groaned under my weight, each step announcing my presence to whatever might be listening. The banister felt oddly warm beneath my palm, as if recently touched by other hands. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms opened off a central hallway, their doors standing at various angles like partially closed eyes. Wallpaper curled away from the corners in long, finger-like strips, and water stains bloomed across the ceiling in patterns that suggested faces when I looked at them sidelong. In the largest bedroom, I discovered the first truly unsettling detail. Someone had carved symbols into the wooden floor. Not random scratches, but deliberate marks arranged in intricate patterns. The carvings were fresh enough to show pale wood beneath the surface stain, yet the house had supposedly been empty for years. I knelt for a closer examination and felt the hair on my arms rise. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, taking on new configurations that made no logical sense. I photographed the carvings with my phone, but the images came out strangely distorted, the symbols blurred beyond recognition despite my steady hands. The camera's flash seemed to reveal movement in the shadows that hadn't been there moments before, quick, darting shapes that vanished the instant I looked up from the screen. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly as I worked, my breath beginning to mist despite the warm October afternoon. I could hear something moving in the walls now, a steady scratching that seemed to circle the room just behind the plaster. The sound grew louder and more urgent, as if whatever made it was trying to claw its way through to reach me. I decided to retreat to the main floor, but as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the hardwood below, each one echoing through the empty rooms with deliberate precision. I stood motionless, straining to locate the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The footsteps ceased abruptly, replaced by a new sound that defied description. It was like static electricity given voice, a crackling, buzzing noise that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The sound built in intensity, becoming almost unbearable, before cutting off with such suddenness that the resulting silence felt like a physical blow. I descended the stairs with exaggerated care, each step planned and measured. The house felt different now, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. The air shimmered with heat waves despite the growing cold, and I could taste copper on my tongue, the metallic tang of fear or something far worse. In the front hallway, I stopped to gather my equipment, eager to escape the increasingly oppressive atmosphere. That's when I saw it. At first, it appeared to be just a shadow cast by the stair banister, a dark patch on the wall that shouldn't have existed given the angle of the light. But as I watched, the shadow began to move independently of any light source, peeling away from the wall like black paper catching fire. It writhed and twisted, growing more defined, until it resembled a rough human silhouette about 3 feet in height. The figure crackled with the same electric static I'd heard upstairs, sparks of impossible light dancing along its edges like St. Elmo's fire. It had no discernible features, yet I felt absolutely certain it was looking at me with an intelligence both alien and malevolent. We regarded each other across the dusty hallway for what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds. Then it moved. The thing rushed toward me with inhuman speed, its form shifting and crackling like a poorly tuned television screen. I stumbled backward, my equipment scattering across the floor as panic overtook reason. The crackling grew louder, filling my ears with white noise and making my vision blur at the edges. I could smell ozone and something else, something organic and wrong that spoke of decay masked by electric fire. I turned to run toward the front door, but before I could take more than 2 steps, the door to the cellar slammed shut with tremendous force. The sound reverberated through the house like a gunshot, and I felt the floor vibrate beneath my feet. Other doors throughout the house began to slam in sequence, a percussion of finality that seemed to mock my desperate need to escape. The crackling figure stopped just inches from where I stood, frozen in terror. This close, I could see that it wasn't truly solid. It seemed to be composed of thousands of tiny black lines, like a scribble made manifest and given terrible purpose. The lines shifted constantly, never quite resolving into a stable form, yet somehow maintaining the basic shape of something that had once been human. It raised what might have been an arm, and I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch it. The compulsion was so strong, I found my own hand rising without conscious thought, drawn by a magnetism I couldn't resist. The space between us crackled with energy that made my fillings ache and turned my saliva to metal just as our hands were about to meet. Every door in the house slammed simultaneously. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations. When my vision cleared and my ears stopped ringing, the figure was gone. I stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by my scattered equipment, gasping like a drowning man who'd suddenly found air. I gathered my things with shaking hands and fled the house, not caring about the photos I hadn't taken or the measurements I hadn't recorded. The key turned easily in the lock behind me, but I could swear I heard footsteps echoing through the empty rooms as I hurried down the front steps. That was 3 weeks ago. I submitted a brief report citing structural concerns and recommended against purchase. The bank accepted my assessment without question, and the house remains empty. But I drive past it every day on my way to work, and each time I notice new details that shouldn't be there. Fresh footprints in the dust on the porch, windows that stand open despite being locked. And sometimes, late at night, when I lie awake staring at the ceiling, I can still hear that crackling sound echoing in my ears, a reminder of something that may have been real, or may have been the first sign of a mind beginning to fray at the edges. I've started seeing other shadows that move independently of their sources, brief glimpses in my peripheral vision of dark figures that vanish when I turn to look directly at them. My doctor suggests stress, perhaps brought on by the upcoming divorce and the pressures of work. He's prescribed medication that dulls the edges of perception and makes everything feel wrapped in cotton. But the pills can't explain the photographs I discovered on my phone, images I don't remember taking, showing rooms in the house I never entered. In each picture, if I look carefully, I can make out a small, dark figure standing in the corner, crackling with electric light, and watching the camera with what might be eyes. Sometimes I think about going back to the house on Elm Street, not to appraise it, but to understand what I encountered in that dusty hallway, to determine once and for all whether the crackling figure was real, or whether my mind has finally begun to betray me in ways I can't yet comprehend. The key to the house still sits in my desk drawer, heavier than it should be, waiting. Story 3. The coffee had long gone cold in my cup, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Across the flickering campfire, the weathered face of the anti-poaching ranger remained etched in shadow and orange light, his words still hanging in the thick African air like smoke from green wood. The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the distant calls of nightbirds and the soft rustle of something moving through the tall grass beyond our camp's perimeter. I'd come to the reserve as a wildlife researcher, documenting leopard behavior patterns for a conservation grant. Simple work, really. Set up cameras, track movement, record data, academic and sterile. But 3 weeks into my stay, the stories began to find me. First whispered in fragments by the local guides, then reluctantly shared by the lodge staff, and finally, tonight, laid bare by this grizzled ranger whose eyes held the weight of too many sleepless nights. He'd told me about the guide first, a man who'd worked these lands for 15 years, knew every waterhole and game trail like the lines on his palm. But rules were rules in the reserve, and some boundaries weren't meant to be crossed. The restricted sector had been off limits for months, ever since the incidents began. Yet this guide, call him Thompson, had convinced a wealthy tourist that a night excursion into the forbidden zone would yield the ultimate leopard photographs. They'd left just after sunset, the ranger explained, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. The Jeep's engine had been heard growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed entirely by the darkness. That was the last time anyone saw Thompson alive. The search party found the vehicle the next morning, its doors hanging open like broken wings. The equipment was scattered, cameras smashed, rifles missing, seats torn as if by massive claws. But no blood, no bodies, just deep gouges in the earth leading away from the Jeep toward a cluster of fever trees, whose pale bark gleamed like bones in the morning sun. The tourist was discovered 3 days later, wandering naked and delirious near the main road, speaking in fragmented sentences about eyes in the darkness and whispers that came from inside his own skull. He was evacuated to a psychiatric facility in the capital and refused to speak about what had happened in the restricted zone. As for Thompson, they never found so much as a thread from his khaki uniform. But it was the second incident that had really shaken the ranger, and as he recounted it, I felt something cold and electric begin to crawl up my spine. A teenager from one of the luxury lodges, an American kid on safari with his family, had been staying in one of the elevated cabins that overlooked the river. Premium accommodations, the ranger noted bitterly. The kind of place where guests paid premium prices to feel like they were roughing it while enjoying room service and Wi-Fi. The boy had been on the private balcony of his family's cabin, sketching the landscape in a journal while his parents attended a wine tasting in the main lodge. Responsible kid, according to his mother. Always checking in, never wandering off alone. The kind of teenager who followed rules and respected boundaries. The last anyone saw of him, he was seated on the balcony's edge, feet dangling over the railing, pencil moving across the page in the dying light of sunset. A lodge employee had noticed him there while delivering fresh towels to a neighboring cabin. When the parents returned an hour later, the balcony was empty. The journal lay open on the wooden planking, a half-finished sketch of acacia trees bleeding off the page where the pencil had been dragged across the paper. What unsettled me most about the ranger's account wasn't what had happened. It was what happened afterward. The lodge immediately organized search parties, combing the banks of the river and the surrounding bush. They found tracks, all right. Leopard prints in the soft earth below the balcony, mixed with the smaller impressions of human feet. But the tracks didn't tell a story of attack or struggle. They suggested something far more disturbing, that the boy had climbed down from the balcony willingly, following the leopard into the darkness. The family left the next day, of course, but not before the lodge manager made a decision that still haunted the ranger months later. They tracked down the leopard responsible, a large male whose territory included the lodge grounds, and shot him. Professional hunters were brought in, and the animal was killed with clinical efficiency. The body was examined, the ranger told me, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Standard procedure when a big cat was involved in a human disappearance. They needed to know if there were any remains, any evidence of what had transpired. But when they opened the leopard's stomach, they found nothing. No clothing, no human tissue, no bones. Just the normal contents of a cat that had been feeding on impala and warthog. Yet the boy was never found. The ranger paused then, poking at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-scattered sky. When he spoke again, his words carried a weight that seemed to settle in my chest like a stone. The thing that bothered him most, he said, wasn't the disappearances themselves. In 30 years of working these lands, he'd seen people lost to everything from flash floods to charging buffalo. Nature was indifferent to human arrogance, and those who forgot that lesson rarely got a second chance to learn it. No, what bothered him was the pattern. The way both incidents seemed to revolve around that same restricted sector, the place where Thompson had taken his final ill-fated excursion. The way the missing people had seemed to go willingly, following something deeper into the wilderness instead of fighting against it. And most of all, the reports from other staff members about strange sounds coming from that forbidden zone, sounds that didn't match any known animal calls in the region. As he spoke, I found myself glancing repeatedly over my shoulder at the darkness pressing in around our camp. The fire seemed smaller than it had moments before, its circle of light more fragile against the vast African night. Somewhere in the distance, a hyena called out, its laughter carrying across the savannah like a mockery of human concern. I'd been planning to visit the restricted sector myself, I realized with growing unease. My research on leopard territorial behavior had led me to believe that the area might contain important denning sites or hunting corridors. I'd already filed the necessary permits and planned to begin my survey work there the following week. But listening to the ranger's account, feeling the weight of his warnings settle around me like a shroud, I began to question whether some boundaries existed for reasons that transcended bureaucratic caution. The ranger stood then, stretching his weathered frame and beginning to bank the fire for the night. As the flames died down, the darkness seemed to surge forward, hungry and alive. He advised me to think carefully about my research plans, to consider whether the data I hoped to collect was worth the risks involved. There were other territories to study, other populations to document. The leopards in the restricted zone could keep their secrets. I nodded agreement, but even as I did, I felt a strange pull toward that forbidden landscape. It was more than scientific curiosity. It was something deeper, more primal, like a whisper at the edge of hearing, calling me toward answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. That night, lying in my tent with the zipper pulled tight and my flashlight close at hand, I found sleep impossible. Every sound from the darkness outside seemed magnified, fraught with potential meaning. The soft footfalls of some nocturnal creature became the measured pace of something stalking our camp. The rustle of wind through the grass transformed into whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. But it was the dreams, when they finally came, that truly unnerved me. I dreamed of walking through landscapes that felt both familiar and utterly alien. Acacia trees whose branches twisted into impossible geometries, waterholes that reflected skies from different seasons, paths that led simultaneously forward and backward through time. And always, at the periphery of my vision, the golden form of a leopard moving with fluid grace through shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. In the dream, I followed that cat willingly, eagerly even, my feet finding their own way along trails I'd never walked before. The leopard would pause occasionally, looking back at me with eyes that held an intelligence far beyond animal instinct, as if checking to ensure I was still following. And I was. Each time it moved forward, I felt compelled to continue, drawn by something that went beyond mere curiosity, into the realm of absolute necessity. I woke just before dawn, my heart racing and my skin slick with sweat despite the cool morning air. The ranger was already up, moving quietly around the cold remains of our fire, preparing coffee with the methodical motions of someone who'd performed the same ritual thousands of times before. He looked at me as I emerged from my tent, and something in his expression suggested he knew exactly what kind of night I'd experienced. Without speaking, he handed me a steaming mug and gestured toward the eastern horizon, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to chase away the stars. We stood in comfortable silence for a long time, sipping our coffee and watching the sky gradually lighten. Finally, the ranger spoke. The restricted zone would remain off-limits to my research, he informed me. New directives had come down from the Reserve Administration overnight. All permits for that area were being suspended indefinitely, pending further investigation into what he carefully termed environmental anomalies. I should have felt relieved. The rational part of my mind certainly was. I could continue my work in other areas, gather the data I needed for my grant, and complete my research without venturing into whatever mysteries lay hidden in that forbidden landscape. But instead, I felt a strange sense of loss, as if something vital had been taken from me before I'd even known I wanted it. As we packed up the camp and prepared to return to the main research station, I found myself looking repeatedly toward the restricted zone. From our position, it was invisible beyond a line of rocky hills that rose like sleeping giants from the savanna floor. But I could feel it there, waiting, patient as only the African wilderness could be. The ranger noticed my glances and offered one final piece of advice. Some mysteries, he suggested, were meant to remain unsolved. Some boundaries existed not to keep people out, but to keep something else contained. The smart move was to focus on the work I could do safely, publish my findings, and return to whatever university or research institution had sponsored my expedition. But as we drove away from our campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that my real research had only just begun. The dreams had shown me something. Not the whole truth, perhaps, but enough of it to ignite a hunger for understanding that no amount of rational caution could fully suppress. And late that night, as I lay in my bed at the research station with the sounds of civilization humming softly around me, I began to plan my return to the restricted zone. Not through official channels, with permits and permissions and safety protocols, but alone, in the hours when darkness made all territories equal, when the boundaries between the possible and impossible became as fluid as shadows on water. After all, some questions could only be answered by those brave enough, or foolish enough, to ask them in person. The leopard was waiting for me in my dreams again, its golden eyes holding secrets I was finally ready to learn. Story 4. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed with that familiar electric hum that had become the soundtrack to my insomnia. 3:30 in the morning, and I was wiping down the same spot on the bar counter for the 5th time, watching the condensation rings disappear and reappear like ghosts of drinks long forgotten. The 24-hour convenience store attached to our little dive bar never truly slept, but at this hour, it might as well have been a mausoleum. I'd been working the graveyard shift at Crossroads for 8 months now, ever since the divorce papers came through and sleep became something that happened to other people. The owner didn't care that I had no formal bartending experience. He just needed someone willing to serve coffee and energy drinks to truckers and insomniacs, while keeping an eye on the attached convenience store through the connecting doorway. That's when I first noticed them. 2 men had been nursing the same gas station coffee for over an hour, seated at a corner table where they could see both the bar and the store entrance. The taller one wore a navy baseball cap pulled low, casting his features in shadow. His companion was stockier, with fingers that drummed incessantly against his styrofoam cup. Neither had spoken a word to me beyond ordering, but I could feel their attention like static electricity before a storm. The air conditioning unit wheezed and clicked, struggling against the late summer humidity that seeped through every crack in the building's aging structure. Outside, the parking lot stretched empty except for my rusted Honda and their dark sedan, a vehicle I'd begun to recognize from previous nights, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had first appeared. I moved toward the connecting doorway to check on the convenience store side, my footsteps echoing hollowly against the linoleum. The night cashier, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s whose name tag read Rivera, glanced up from her magazine. She'd been working nights here longer than anyone, and possessed an uncanny ability to read people that border on supernatural. "Those 2 giving you trouble?" she asked without looking directly at the men, her voice barely above a whisper. I pretended to arrange the candy display near the register. "What do you mean?" "Been coming in every night this week. Always order the same thing. Always sit in the same spot. Always watching." Her eyes flicked toward the security monitor showing multiple angles of both establishments. Security noticed too. A chill crawled up my spine despite the oppressive heat. I hadn't realized they'd been coming in every night. The shifts blurred together in a haze of caffeine and artificial light, but now that she mentioned it, fragments of memory began coalescing. The baseball cap, the drumming fingers, the way they always arrived within 10 minutes of each other, never together, but clearly coordinated. The bell above the store entrance chimed, and a trucker stumbled in, seeking cigarettes and directions to the nearest motel. Rivera served him with professional efficiency while I retreated to the bar, acutely aware of how the 2 men's heads tracked my movement like security cameras. The taller one finally stood, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on chalkboard. He approached the bar with measured steps, each footfall deliberate and heavy. Up close, I could see his eyes, pale blue and unnaturally bright, as if lit from within. "Another coffee," he said, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't place. Not foreign exactly, but wrong somehow, like words spoken through water. I turned to the coffee pot, hands trembling slightly as I poured. When I set the cup before him, his fingers brushed mine, ice cold despite the sweltering night. He smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. "You work here often?" The question sounded innocent enough, but something in his tone made my skin crawl. Most nights, I replied, stepping back toward the register. Long hours. Must get lonely. His companion had risen now, moving to stand by the connecting doorway, positioning himself between me and Rivera. Especially for someone going through changes. The blood in my veins turned to slush. How could he possibly know about the divorce, about the sleepless nights and the way my life had imploded? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The stocky man's drumming intensified, now tapping against the doorframe in a rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. The fluorescent light above their table began to flicker, casting shifting shadows that moved independently of their bodies. "We should talk," the tall one continued, leaning against the bar. Outside, away from interruptions. I glanced toward Rivera, who had abandoned her magazine and was watching us with intense focus. Her hand rested near the phone, fingers poised to dial. The security camera in the corner swiveled slightly. Someone was definitely paying attention. "I'm working," I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Work can wait." The man's smile widened, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw too many teeth in his mouth. "We have a proposition for you. A new opportunity. Better hours, better pay, better everything." The words should have sounded appealing, but they landed like ice chips in my stomach. Everything about this felt wrong. The timing, the location, the way they moved with predatory grace. The way the shadows seemed to bend around them despite the harsh overhead lighting. "Thanks, but I'm not interested," I said, backing toward the register. The stocky man's drumming stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed felt pregnant with threat. The air grew thick, almost viscous, making each breath a conscious effort. The fluorescent lights flickered more violently now, strobing like a dying lighthouse. "Everyone's interested in something," the tall man said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We just need to find what motivates you." That's when Rivera appeared in the doorway, her expression grim but determined. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to finish your coffee and move along. We're closing early tonight for maintenance." "The sign says 24 hours, the stocky man replied, his first words of the evening carrying a hint of menace. "Sign's wrong." Rivera's voice carried the authority of someone who dealt with every type of trouble this place could attract. "We close when I say we close." I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. A large man in a security uniform had materialized near the store's back office, his presence somehow reassuring despite the surreal circumstances. He wore no name tag, but moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to handle difficult situations. The two men exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. The tall one's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes, a predatory calculation that made my knees weak. "Of course," he said finally. "We understand completely." He placed exact change on the bar, coins that felt wrong when I touched them, too heavy, too cold. "We'll be seeing you again soon." They moved toward the exit with fluid synchronization, but paused at the door. The tall one turned back, his pale eyes finding mine across the room. "Dreams can be such fragile things," he said. "So easy to shatter. So easy to replace." The door chimed their departure, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. I watched through the window as they climbed into their sedan, noting how the vehicle seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The engine started with a sound like grinding metal, and they pulled away into the pre-dawn darkness. Rivera approached the bar, her face pale but resolute. "That was close," she said simply. "Close to what?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would only raise more questions. "You don't want to know." She glanced at the security guard, who nodded and disappeared back into the office. "But they won't give up easily. These types never do. These types..." The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "What exactly are you talking about?" Rivera studied my face for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth I could handle. "There are people, if you can call them that, who feed on disruption, on life transitions, divorce, job loss, death in the family. They can smell vulnerability like sharks smell blood. The rational part of my mind rejected her words as late-night paranoia, but another part, the part that had felt their unnatural coldness and seen shadows move wrong, whispered that she might be telling the truth. "What do they want?" I asked. "To take you somewhere else. Somewhere you can start fresh." Her expression darkened. "Except the fresh start isn't for you. It's for someone else who needs your space." I thought about the man's pale eyes, his knowledge of my personal situation, the way reality seemed to bend around their presence. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Rivera moved to the window, peering out at the empty parking lot. "Think about it. When did you first notice them? Really notice them?" I tried to remember, but the memories were slippery, like trying to hold water. Had it been a week? A month? The days blurred together in an endless cycle of fluorescent light and sleepless exhaustion. "I can't," I started, then stopped. Because suddenly I could remember, not their first visit, but something else. A conversation with my ex-wife weeks ago, where she'd mentioned seeing strange men asking questions about me around our old neighborhood, wanting to know about my habits, my schedule, my state of mind. "They've been watching you longer than you realize," Rivera said, as if reading my thoughts. "Building a profile, learning your patterns. Tonight was supposed to be the collection." "Collection?" They had a van waiting around back. Saw it on the cameras. She gestured toward the security monitor. "If you'd gone outside with them." The implication hung in the air like smoke. I felt a wave of nausea as the full scope of what had almost happened crashed over me. The coffee cups they'd been nursing. Had they even been drinking from them? The coordinated positioning, the knowledge of my personal life, the way they'd tried to isolate me from help. "Why didn't you call the police?" I asked. Rivera's laugh held no humor. "And tell them what? That two men bought coffee and sat quietly for an hour? That they asked someone to step outside? The authorities don't believe in things that exist in the spaces between normal and nightmare." The security guard reappeared, his expression grim. "Vehicle's been circling the block for the past 10 minutes. They're not giving up." "Then we wait," Rivera said. "Morning shift comes in at 6. Daylight makes them less effective." We settled into an uneasy vigil, watching the monitors and listening for the sound of car engines. I found myself questioning everything: the nature of my observers, the reality of my own perceptions, the thin line between paranoia and survival instinct. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale yellow, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. The fluorescent lights seemed less harsh, the shadows more natural. By the time the morning cashier arrived, chirping about traffic and weather, the entire encounter felt like a shared hallucination. But the cold coins still sat on the bar where the tall man had left them, and when I picked them up, they seemed to whisper against my palm. Sounds like distant screaming, like doors slamming shut, like the final breath of something that had once been human. Rivera watched me examine the coins, her expression unreadable. "Throw them away," she advised. "Some payments aren't worth keeping." I wanted to ask more questions about who they really were, how she knew so much about them, whether this was over or just beginning. But the morning light streaming through the windows made such questions feel absurd, like asking about monsters under the bed while surrounded by coffee cups and candy bars. Instead, I pocketed the coins, telling myself I'd examine them more closely later. Rivera shook her head disapprovingly but said nothing more. As I prepared to leave for the day, exhaustion finally catching up with me, Rivera called out from behind the register. "Next week, your working days," she said firmly. "No arguments." I nodded gratefully and pushed through the exit, stepping into a world that suddenly felt vast and dangerous. My Honda sat alone in the parking lot, covered in morning dew that sparkled like scattered diamonds. Normal, ordinary, real. But as I drove home through empty suburban streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that normalcy was a thin veneer over something much darker. The coins in my pocket seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and in my rearview mirror, I thought I glimpsed a dark sedan maintaining careful distance. Maybe Rivera was right about protective daylight. Maybe the night shift attracted things that shouldn't exist. Or maybe I was losing my mind. constructing elaborate paranoid fantasies to cope with the mundane horror of divorce and insomnia. The truth, I realized with growing unease, might be far worse than either possibility, because as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that my ex-wife's car was parked across the street, the car she'd sold 3 weeks ago. And through the windshield, barely visible in the morning shadows, I could see 2 figures watching my house with pale, unnatural eyes. Story 5. The stench hit me before I even reached the front door. 3 days of August heat had turned the modest ranch house into an oven, and whatever was cooking inside had been left on the burner too long. Mrs. Chen from next door had called it in. Hadn't seen her neighbor in nearly a week. Mail piling up, newspapers scattered across the driveway like yellow leaves. Standard welfare check, nothing I hadn't done 100 times before in my 15 years with the department. But the smell told a different story. I'd smelled death before. Traffic accidents, overdoses, the occasional heart attack that went undiscovered for days. This was different, sweeter, thicker. It clung to the inside of my nostrils and seemed to coat my throat with each breath. The kind of smell that follows you home and lingers in your uniform long after you've stripped it off. The front door was unlocked, not unusual in this neighborhood where people still trusted their neighbors and left their cars running while they grabbed coffee. I announced myself, more out of habit than hope. The silence that answered was complete, heavy, like the air itself had died. The living room looked normal enough. A recliner pointed toward a small television, remote control balanced on the armrest. Stack of books on a side table. Mysteries, the kind with dark covers and bold fonts. A coffee mug sat on the end table, a ring of mold floating on the surface like a tiny green island. That's when I heard it, a wet, rhythmic sound coming from down the hallway. Like someone eating soup, but slower, more deliberate. The sound of something being savored. My hand found my radio, thumb hovering over the call button. Protocol said to retreat, call for backup, wait for the coroner. But 15 years of muscle memory pulled me forward, one careful step after another down that narrow hallway. The floorboards creaked under my weight, each sound unnaturally loud in the thick silence. The smell grew stronger with each step. Not just the sweet rot of decomposition, but something else underneath. Something earthy and primal that made my stomach clench. The kind of smell that awakened something ancient in the back of my brain. Some primitive warning system that screamed danger in a language older than words. The master bedroom door stood ajar. Through the gap, I could see a slice of the room beyond. A window with drawn curtains, a dresser with scattered papers, and there, on the floor beside the bed, a small shape moving with purpose. A dog. Terrier mix, maybe 15 pounds soaking wet, with matted brown fur and bright black eyes. It looked up at me as I pushed the door open, tail wagging tentatively, something pale clutched in its jaws. The man on the bed had been there for days. I won't describe what the heat had done to him, or the way the sheets had become part of him, or how his face had changed into something that barely resembled human features. What I will say is that he was alone, had been alone, except for the little dog that had somehow survived by improvising its own meals. The dog dropped what it had been chewing and approached me, tail still wagging, head tilted in that universal canine expression of innocent curiosity. Up close I could see the dark stains around its muzzle, the way its small pink tongue kept darting out to clean its lips. I should have called it in then, should have backed out of that room and waited for the professionals. Instead, I found myself kneeling down, extending my hand to the little creature. It sniffed my fingers cautiously, then began to lick them with surprising gentleness. That's when I noticed the watch. It was still on the man's wrist, a simple digital model with a black plastic band. The display glowed faintly in the dim room, showing not the time, but a pattern of numbers that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. 12:34, 11:47, 15:73, 15:73. That wasn't a time, wasn't anything. I blinked hard, shook my head. When I looked again, the watch read 2:17 p.m. Perfectly normal. My imagination, stress, the overwhelming smell playing tricks on my perception. The dog had wandered back to its original spot and resumed its meal. I called it in. The next hour passed in a blur of procedures and paperwork. The coroner arrived, along with Detective Reynolds and two uniforms I recognized but couldn't name. They took photos, measured angles, bagged evidence. Standard procedure for an unattended death, even one as straightforward as this appeared to be. The man's name had been Harold Voss, according to his driver's license. 63 years old, retired postal worker, no next of kin listed in any of his papers. His neighbor, Mrs. Chen, mentioned that he'd seemed depressed lately, had been talking about feeling useless since his retirement. The pistol beside the bed told the rest of the story, or seemed to. But something nagged at me as I watched the coroner's team prepare the body for transport. Something about the scene felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Maybe it was the dog's behavior, the way it seemed so calm, so content, despite what it had been doing. Maybe it was the watch, still displaying those impossible numbers every time I glanced at it. Or maybe it was the way Harold's eyes seemed to follow me as they lifted him onto the gurney. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the little dog. Animal control had taken it to the shelter, where it would likely be held for a few days before being put up for adoption. I found myself thinking about its bright black eyes, the way it had licked my fingers so gently after I called the shelter. The woman who answered sounded tired, distracted. Background noise of barking dogs and slamming cage doors made it difficult to hear her clearly. I explained about the dog from the Voss residence, asked about adoption procedures. "What dog?" she asked. "Brown terrier mix, about 15 pounds. Brought in this afternoon from a death scene on Maple Street." A pause. Papers rustling. "I don't show any intake from that address today." "You sure you have the right shelter?" I was sure. Dead sure. I'd watched Officer Martinez load the dog into the animal control van myself, had even gotten the shelter's number from him, but the woman insisted they had no record of any animal from that address. I called Martinez directly. "What dog?" he asked, echoing the shelter worker's confusion. "There wasn't any dog at that scene." "You feeling okay, partner?" "It was a rough one, I know, but..." He kept talking, but I couldn't focus on his words, because I was staring at my hand, at the fingers the dog had licked so gently. In the lamplight of my kitchen, I could see small marks on my knuckles. Tiny puncture wounds, barely visible, arranged in a perfect semicircle. Bite marks. I spent the next 3 days trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination. Stress-induced psychosis, maybe, or some kind of delayed reaction to years of exposure to traumatic scenes. I'd heard of other cops experiencing similar episodes, seeing things that weren't there, remembering events that had never happened. But the bite marks were real enough. They were healing now. Small scabs forming where tiny teeth had broken the skin. I found myself obsessing over them, touching them constantly, trying to remember the exact moment it had happened. The dog had been so gentle when it licked my fingers, but at some point, when? It must have bitten me. Except that according to everyone else, there had been no dog. On Thursday, I drove back to Harold Voss's house. The place stood empty now, yellow tape still stretched across the front door like a warning. The neighbors had already moved on, their lives uninterrupted by the brief drama that had played out next door. Mrs. Chen's curtains twitched as I parked across the street, but she didn't come out to talk. I sat in my patrol car for nearly an hour, watching the house and trying to understand what was happening to me. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in procedure and evidence, insisted that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown. But another part, something deeper and more primitive, whispered that I was remembering something everyone else had forgotten, or something that had been deliberately erased. As the sun began to set, I noticed movement in one of the windows. Just a flicker, barely visible through the closed curtains. Probably just a reflection, or shadows playing tricks as the light changed. But for just a moment, it had looked like something small moving back and forth across the glass. Something about the size of a terrier, I got out of the car. The front door was still sealed, but the backyard gate stood slightly ajar. I told myself I was just checking the perimeter, making sure the scene was secure. Standard procedure, nothing more. But my hand was shaking as I pushed through the gate and approached the back door. It was unlocked. The smell hit me again as soon as I stepped inside. That same sweet, cloying odor that had filled the house 3 days earlier. But that was impossible. The body had been removed, the scene cleaned and processed. There should have been nothing left but empty rooms and fading memories. Yet the smell was stronger than ever. I made my way through the kitchen and into the living room, following the scent like a bloodhound. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get back in my car and drive away and never think about Harold Voss or his house again. But I couldn't stop moving forward, couldn't resist the pull of whatever was waiting for me in that master bedroom. The door stood open now, wide enough for me to see the entire room. It was exactly as we'd left it. Stripped bed, scattered papers, empty space where Harold's body had lain. Nothing out of place, nothing that shouldn't have been there. Except for the watch. It sat on the nightstand where I remembered seeing it. Digital display glowing softly in the dim light. But that was wrong too. The watch had been removed with the body, bagged as evidence along with Harold's wallet and keys. I'd seen Reynolds tag it myself. I approached slowly, afraid to look too closely at the display, but I couldn't help myself. The numbers seemed to pulse with each step I took, changing and shifting in patterns that hurt to follow. 2391, 4715, 8888, and then, just for a moment, they stabilized. 12, Klaus, midnight, but my own watch showed 6:47 p.m. That's when I heard the sound again. That wet, rhythmic chewing coming from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see, but the room was empty. No dog, no movement, nothing but shadows and the lingering smell of decay. But the sound continued. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls in ways that defied acoustics. The sound of something small and determined working its way through something that shouldn't have been there. Something that had been missed, overlooked, forgotten by everyone except the creature that had found it. I backed toward the door, but my feet felt heavy, reluctant to carry me away from whatever revelation waited in that room. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as if responding to my attention, as if it wanted to be heard, as if it wanted to be remembered. "There's no dog," I said aloud, my voice barely a whisper in the thick air. There never was a dog. The chewing stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, from somewhere in the darkness at the foot of the bed, came the soft sound of claws clicking against hardwood. Slow, deliberate steps moving in my direction. I ran. I don't remember leaving the house or getting back to my car. The next clear memory I have is sitting in my driveway at home, hands shaking as I tried to fit the key into my front door. It was nearly midnight. Somehow 6 hours had passed without me noticing, and my uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air. Inside, I went straight to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My face looked pale, drawn, older than it had that morning. But it was my hands that drew my attention. The bite marks were gone, not healed, gone. The skin was smooth and unblemished, showing no sign that anything had ever broken it. Yet I could still feel them, phantom sensations of tiny teeth pressing into my flesh. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. When I finally returned to work, everyone treated me normally. No questions about the Voss case, no concerns about my mental state. According to the official report, Harold Voss had died alone in his bedroom, discovered by Officer Chen during a routine welfare check. No mention of a dog, no mention of anything unusual, no mention of me at all. It was as if I had never been there, as if my entire memory of that afternoon existed in some parallel reality that only I could access. The rational explanation was obvious. I had suffered some kind of psychotic break, confabulated an entire narrative around a straightforward death scene. It happens to cops more often than the department likes to admit. But late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I can still hear it. The sound of small teeth working through something that shouldn't exist, in a room that should be empty, belonging to a creature that everyone insists was never there. the rhythmic, patient sound of something that knows the truth, even when everyone else has forgotten. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I can feel those gentle teeth against my fingers again. Not biting this time, but tasting, testing, learning the flavor of someone who remembers what others have been made to forget. The watch is still there, I think, still counting time that doesn't exist, in a house that should be empty, waiting for someone else to find it, to see what I saw, to remember what I remember. But they won't remember for long, because in the morning there will be no bite marks to prove it happened, no official report to confirm their story, no little dog with bright black eyes and dark stains around its muzzle to validate their memory. There will only be the sound, echoing in the corners of their mind, growing fainter with each passing day until they begin to doubt they ever heard it at all, until they convince themselves it was all just their imagination. Just like I'm trying to convince myself now, but I know better. And somewhere in that empty house on Maple Street, something small and patient knows better too. It's still waiting, still chewing, still remembering what the rest of us have been made to forget. And one day, when I'm not strong enough to resist anymore, I'll go back. I'll walk through that unlocked door and down that narrow hallway, following the sound and the smell to their source. And this time, I won't run. This time, I'll remember everything, even if no one else ever will. Story 6. The house smelled like dust and forgotten prayers when I stepped through the front door that October evening. 23 years had passed since I'd last walked these halls, since I'd last heard the floorboards creak their familiar symphony under my feet. The estate lawyer had been apologetic about the delay in reaching me. Apparently, tracking down the only surviving relative of the Hartwell family had proven more challenging than expected. I set my overnight bag down in the foyer and absorbed the stillness. Everything remained exactly as I remembered from my childhood visits to Uncle Robert's place. The grandfather clock standing sentinel in the corner, its pendulum long since stilled. The faded floral wallpaper that had probably been fashionable sometime in the 1950s. The narrow staircase ascending into shadow. Even the smell was identical, a mixture of old wood, mothballs, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and earthy that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The property stretched across 12 acres of dense woodland, with the old Victorian house sitting like a weathered island in an ocean of oak and pine. Uncle Robert had been a reclusive man, preferring the company of his books and his trees to human interaction. I'd spent several summers here as a boy, running wild through those woods while the adults talked in hushed tones about things I wasn't supposed to understand. I moved through the house methodically, room by room, taking inventory of what would need to be sorted, sold, or discarded. The task felt overwhelming. Every surface was covered with the accumulated detritus of a long life lived in solitude. Stacks of yellowed newspapers, collections of smooth river stones, jars filled with unidentifiable dried specimens. In the study, leather-bound journals filled an entire wall of shelving, their spines worn smooth by countless readings. It was while I stood in that study, contemplating the magnitude of the sorting task ahead, that I first glimpsed movement through the window. Something small and quick darted between the tree trunks, too distant and too brief to identify with any certainty. The autumn light was failing, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and breathe with their own life. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to follow the movement. But whatever I'd seen had vanished into the gathering dusk. The sensation of being watched settled over me like a cold blanket. I found myself scanning the tree line more frequently, my eyes drawn irresistibly to the spaces between the trunks where darkness pooled like stagnant water. The feeling was irrational, I knew, but it persisted with the stubborn intensity of a childhood fear. That first night, I slept fitfully in Uncle Robert's old bedroom. The house seemed to expand and contract around me, creaking and settling with sounds that felt too deliberate to be random. Somewhere in the small hours, I was jerked awake by what sounded like footsteps on the front porch. I lay motionless, straining to hear, but the silence that followed was absolute. When I finally worked up the courage to check the window, the porch was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. The next morning brought crisp air and brilliant sunshine that made the previous night's fears seem foolish. I threw myself into the work of cataloging Uncle Robert's possessions, grateful for the distraction. Box after box of photographs revealed a life I'd never fully understood. Images of Uncle Robert as a young man, always alone, always outdoors, always looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. It was while sorting through these photographs that I found the journal entry that made my blood run cold. Uncle Robert's spidery handwriting described in meticulous detail the same sensation I'd experienced the day before, the feeling of being watched from the woods, the glimpses of movement that vanished the moment he tried to focus on them. But his entries went further, describing a small figure that appeared to be limping as it moved between the trees. "The boy is back again," one entry read. "Always just at the edge of vision, always moving away when I try to approach. There's something wrong with his gait, something broken in the way he carries himself. He's been coming closer to the house each day, though he never ventures into the open. I think he wants something from me, but I can't imagine what." The entries spanned decades, describing the same phenomenon occurring again and again. Uncle Robert had documented his attempts to photograph the figure, his efforts to track its movements, his growing obsession with understanding what he was seeing. The tone of the writing grew increasingly desperate as the years progressed, filled with references to sleepless nights and an oppressive sense of being stalked. I set the journal aside with trembling hands and walked to the study window. The woods looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, but I found myself searching the shadows with new intensity. Uncle Robert had died alone in this house, found days later by a neighbor who'd grown concerned about the overflowing mailbox. The official cause had been heart failure, but reading these entries, I wondered if something else had contributed to his final moments. The second night was worse than the first. I'd barely drifted off when a sound from outside brought me instantly awake, a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. The sound seemed to circle the house, moving from window to window with deliberate precision. I followed it from room to room, always arriving just as it moved to the next location. When I finally worked up the nerve to look outside, I saw nothing but empty lawn and the dark wall of trees beyond. But as I stood at the kitchen window, something shifted in my peripheral vision. A small, hunched shape moved awkwardly between the tree trunks, its gait clearly labored and uneven. The figure was too distant to make out clearly, but there was something horribly familiar about its movements, something that stirred memories I couldn't quite grasp. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the back door, driven by a mixture of curiosity and determination that I couldn't explain. The night air was sharp against my skin as I stepped onto the back porch, the beam of my flashlight cutting a pale swath through the darkness. I called out, my voice swallowed immediately by the vast silence of the woods. The figure had vanished, but as I stood there in the darkness, I became aware of other sounds. The soft rustle of leaves where there was no wind, the crack of a branch somewhere in the distance, the barely audible sound of something moving through the underbrush. The sounds seemed to be drawing closer, forming a loose circle around the house. I retreated inside and spent the rest of the night sitting in the kitchen with all the lights on, Uncle Robert's journal open before me. Page after page described experiences identical to my own, the same progression from curiosity to unease to outright terror. In his final entries, Uncle Robert wrote about dreams where he was being followed through the woods by something that called his name in a voice he recognized but couldn't place. The following morning, I found myself drawn back to the study window, scanning the tree line with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The rational part of my mind insisted that I was simply processing grief and stress in an unhealthy way, that the isolation and the weight of Uncle Robert's accumulated solitude were affecting my perception. But as the day wore on, I caught more glimpses of movement in the woods, always distant, always brief, always that same hunched, limping figure. I began to notice other things as well. The grandfather clock in the foyer had somehow started running again, its pendulum swinging with metronomic precision despite the fact that I'd never wound it. The temperature in certain rooms seemed to fluctuate wildly, plunging to uncomfortable cold in the space of minutes before returning to normal. Most disturbing of all were the sounds. footsteps on the porch at night, the soft scraping of something being dragged across wooden floors, whispered conversations that stopped the moment I tried to listen. On the third night, I was awakened by the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. The rhythm was different this time, more urgent, more demanding. I approached the window with growing dread, knowing somehow that this time would be different, that whatever had been circling the house for days was finally ready to reveal itself. The figure stood directly beneath my window, close enough that I could make out details that sent ice through my veins. It was small and hunched, wearing clothes that hung in tatters from its skeletal frame. Its movement was severely restricted by what appeared to be a badly damaged leg that dragged behind it as it shifted its weight. But it was the face that truly terrified me, pale and hollow-cheeked, with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors. The figure raised one arm and pointed directly at me, its mouth opening in what might have been speech but produced no sound I could hear. For a long moment we stared at each other through the glass, predator and prey locked in silent communication. Then it turned and limped away into the woods, disappearing between the trees with surprising speed despite its obvious infirmity. I didn't sleep for the remainder of that night. Instead, I sat in the study, reading through Uncle Robert's journals with new understanding. The entries described the same progression I was experiencing: the initial glimpses, the growing obsession, the final confrontation. But Uncle Robert's account went further, describing how the figure had eventually begun appearing during daylight hours, how it had started venturing closer to the house, how it had somehow begun to communicate. "It wants me to remember," one of his final entries read. "There's something I'm supposed to know, something I've forgotten. The way it looks at me, there's recognition there, familiarity, but I can't place it, can't understand what it's trying to tell me. The dreams are getting worse. In them, I'm running through the woods, but I'm not myself. I'm someone smaller, someone younger, someone who's trying to get home but can't find the way." The fourth day brought no relief. The figure appeared repeatedly throughout the daylight hours, always maintaining its distance but never completely disappearing from view. It seemed to be studying the house, learning its routines, waiting for something. I found myself unable to focus on the sorting task, instead spending hours at the windows, watching and being watched in return. It was while searching through a box of Uncle Robert's personal effects that I discovered the photographs that changed everything. Hidden beneath layers of tissue paper were images I'd never seen before, family photographs from decades past, showing faces I didn't recognize. But one photograph stopped me cold. It showed Uncle Robert as a young man, maybe 20 years old, standing in front of this very house. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a small boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with the same dark hair and serious expression. The boy's posture was slightly tilted, one leg clearly shorter than the other, supported by a crude metal brace that was partially visible beneath his pants. On the back of the photograph, in Uncle Robert's careful handwriting, was a single line: "Bobby and Thomas, summer 1952. Thomas. I stared at the name, trying to dredge up any memory of a family member I'd never heard mentioned. Uncle Robert had always been described as an only child, a lifelong bachelor who'd inherited the family property and lived there alone. But here was evidence of someone else, someone whose existence had been carefully erased from the family history. I searched frantically through the remaining photographs and documents, looking for any other reference to Thomas. What I found was a medical record, yellowed with age, describing a young boy's treatment for a severely broken leg that had healed incorrectly, leaving him with a permanent limp. The record was dated 1952, the same year as the photograph. But there were no other records of Thomas, no death certificate, no school records, no further photographs. It was as if he had simply vanished from existence after that summer, leaving behind only medical records and a single photograph as proof that he had ever lived at all. As I sat in the study that evening, staring at the photograph of the two boys, I became aware that the tapping had returned to the windows. But this time it was different, more insistent, more purposeful. The figure appeared at the study window, pressed against the glass with its pale hands spread flat against the surface. Up close, I could see the resemblance more clearly. The same dark hair, the same serious expression, the same eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated sadness. The figure's mouth moved soundlessly, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. It was trying to tell me something, trying to communicate some urgent message that transcended the barrier between us. And as I stared into those hollow eyes, a memory began to surface. Not my own memory, but something deeper, something inherited. Uncle Robert's final journal entry, which I'd initially dismissed as the ravings of a man losing his grip on reality, suddenly made terrible sense. He's not trying to hurt me. He's trying to come home. But something went wrong all those years ago. Something that trapped him between the house and the woods. He's been waiting all this time for someone to remember, someone to understand. I think I'm starting to remember what really happened that summer, but I'm afraid to let myself believe it. Some things are better left buried. The figure at the window pressed closer, its breath fogging the glass, its eyes fixed on mine with desperate intensity. And in that moment, I understood with crystalline clarity that whatever had happened to Thomas in 1952, whatever tragedy had erased him from the family history, it had never truly ended. He had been trapped here for 70 years, limping through the woods, trying to find his way back to a home that no longer acknowledged his existence. But understanding brought no comfort, only a deeper terror. Because if Thomas had been trying to come home for all these decades, if he had been reaching out to Uncle Robert and now to me, then the real question wasn't what he wanted. It was what had prevented him from finding peace all these years. And as the figure began to tap against the window with increasing urgency, I realized that some answers are more terrifying than any question. The house around me seemed to shift and breathe, walls expanding and contracting like lungs, floorboards creaking out a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. The boundary between memory and reality, between past and present, was dissolving before my eyes. Thomas pressed his face against the glass, his mouth forming words that I finally, terrifyingly, began to understand. He wasn't trying to come home at all. He was trying to warn me not to stay, but as I backed away from the window, the photograph still clutched in my trembling hands, I realized it might already be too late. The house had claimed Uncle Robert, had held him here for decades while Thomas watched helplessly from the woods. And now it was reaching for me, drawing me deeper into its embrace with each passing hour. The tapping stopped. The figure at the window faded back into the darkness. And in the sudden silence, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. The sound of footsteps on the staircase, climbing slowly toward the second floor. Footsteps that belonged to someone who walked with a pronounced limp. Someone who had finally found his way inside. Story 7. The apartment had been silent for hours, save for the methodical ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional groan of settling wood. I'd been hunched over my laptop, the blue glow casting long shadows across the living room walls, when everything went dark. Not the gradual dimming of a brownout, but the absolute, instantaneous blackness that swallows sound itself. The hum of the refrigerator died. The clock stopped its metronomic rhythm. Even the distant murmur of traffic from the street below seemed to vanish, as if the darkness had consumed not just light, but life itself. I sat frozen, fingers still poised over keys that no longer existed in the void. The chair creaked as I shifted, the sound unnaturally loud in the vacuum of silence. Then I heard it, a scream, high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the darkness like a blade through silk. But it wasn't just any scream. It started close, somewhere in the building, maybe even my floor, then moved away with that unmistakable shift in pitch that comes when sound travels past you at speed. The Doppler effect, I realized, with the detached clarity that sometimes accompanies shock. The scream was moving, racing away from me through the darkness with impossible velocity. My heart hammered against my ribs as the sound faded into nothing, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt solid, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. I fumbled for my phone, fingers clumsy with adrenaline, but the screen remained black, dead. Then the light snapped on. The sudden illumination hit me like a physical blow, and I squinted against the harsh fluorescent glare that seemed too bright, too white after the absolute darkness. As my eyes adjusted, I saw her. She stood in the corner near the kitchen, impossibly still. One pale arm extended toward me as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Her hair was black, hanging in straight lines that framed a face I couldn't quite focus on, features that seemed to shift whenever I tried to look directly at them. She wore what might have been a dress, but the fabric appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the shape of a person. I blinked, hard, the way you do when you're trying to clear an afterimage from your retinas. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The apartment looked exactly as it had before the blackout. My laptop sat open on the coffee table, though its screen now showed only a cursor blinking on an empty document. The grandfather clock had resumed its ticking, but the time it displayed was wrong, hours ahead of what it should have been. I stood on unsteady legs, scanning every corner of the room. Nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. No disturbance in the careful arrangement of books and furniture, but the air felt different, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying those few seconds of illumination over and over. Had I really seen someone, or had my brain, starved of sensory input during the blackout, manufactured an image to fill the void? The rational part of my mind insisted on the latter, but rationality felt thin and inadequate in the hours before dawn. The next evening, I found myself dreading sunset. I'd spent the day researching power outages in the area, finding nothing that matched what I'd experienced. The electric company had no record of any disruption to service. My neighbors, when I casually asked, reported no problems with their power. I was sitting in the same chair, laptop open to the same empty document, when it happened again. This time, I was ready for the darkness, but not for the sound that preceded it. A soft tapping, like fingernails on glass, came from the direction of the kitchen window. Then everything went black, and in that absolute silence, I heard breathing that wasn't my own. Slow, measured inhalations and exhalations, coming from somewhere near the corner where she had stood. I held my breath, straining to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to move around the room like smoke, never quite where I thought it was. The lights returned with their violent brightness, and there she was again, closer this time. Near the couch, still reaching, still impossibly motionless. Her dark eyes, or what I took to be eyes, seemed to look through me, rather than at me, focused on something behind or beyond my position. This time, I forced myself to keep looking, to study her face, to prove to myself that she was real or not real. But the harder I tried to focus, the more her features seemed to blur and shift, like looking at something underwater. The only constant was that reaching hand, pale fingers stretched toward me with desperate urgency. I spoke into the silence, my voice cracking with disuse and fear. "What do you want?" The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before being absorbed by the oppressive quiet. Then, as if my voice had broken some spell, she was gone again. But this time, something had changed. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Frost was beginning to form on the inside of the windows, delicate patterns that looked almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. Over the following days, the blackouts became regular occurrences, always at the same time, always preceded by that soft tapping. The duration seemed to be increasing, and with each episode, she appeared closer, more substantial. What had begun as a vague silhouette was becoming increasingly defined, though her face remained an unsettling blur of shifting shadows. I tried leaving the apartment during the evening hours, spending time at coffee shops and bookstores, anywhere with bright lights and other people. But no matter where I went, the darkness found me. In bathroom stalls, in empty aisles between shelves, in the space between streetlights on my walk home. And always, when the lights returned, she was there, reaching, pleading with her outstretched hand. Sleep became impossible. Food lost its taste. I found myself avoiding mirrors, afraid of what I might see standing behind my own reflection. My work suffered as I spent my days researching phenomena that had no scientific explanation: shadow people, residual hauntings, psychotic episodes brought on by isolation and stress. Each theory felt both plausible and inadequate. The rational explanations couldn't account for the physical evidence: the frost on the windows, the stopped clocks, the way electronic devices failed during the blackouts. But the supernatural theories required accepting that everything I understood about reality was fundamentally wrong. 2 weeks after the first incident, I made a discovery that sent ice through my veins. While cleaning out old boxes in the bedroom closet, I found a newspaper clipping I didn't remember saving. The headline read, "Local student missing after campus blackout." The accompanying photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and pale skin, features that, while blurry in the newsprint, seemed achingly familiar. According to the article, she had disappeared during a power outage at the university library. Security cameras showed her studying alone in the basement level when the lights went out. When emergency power restored illumination 20 minutes later, she was gone. Her belongings remained on the table, including an open book and a cup of coffee that was still warm. The article was dated 3 years ago, but the newspaper itself was yellowed and brittle, as if it had aged decades. More disturbing still, I had no memory of cutting it out or why I would have saved it. The name of the missing student had been carefully removed, leaving only jagged edges where scissors had cut through the paper. That night, I waited in the living room with every light in the apartment blazing. I had disconnected the main breaker, hoping to prevent another blackout. But as evening approached, I felt the familiar electrical charge building in the air. The tapping came earlier than usual, more insistent. Then, despite my precautions, darkness fell like a curtain. But this time I was determined to understand. Instead of sitting in terrified silence, I stood and moved toward where I knew she would appear. The cold was immediate and overwhelming, but I pressed forward, guided by some instinct I couldn't name. My breath came in visible puffs, and ice crystals began forming on my clothes. "I see you," I whispered into the void. "I know you're here." The breathing sound surrounded me now, and I realized with dawning horror that it was synchronized with my own. We were breathing together, in perfect rhythm, as if sharing the same lungs. The lights blazed on, and she was directly in front of me, close enough to touch. Her reaching hand was inches from my chest, and for the first time, I could see her face clearly. It was beautiful and terrible, with features that seemed familiar yet impossible to place. Her mouth moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Help me," she was saying. "Help me come back." I reached out instinctively, and my fingers brushed against hers. The contact was like touching electricity and ice simultaneously. A shock that traveled up my arm and into my chest, where it settled like a weight around my heart. The moment our skin connected, images flooded my mind. I saw the library basement, saw her studying alone as the lights failed. But I also saw something else, a figure moving through the darkness toward her. Someone she trusted, someone she knew. The betrayal in her eyes as she realized what was happening. The desperate reach toward an emergency phone she would never reach. And I saw myself, standing in that basement 3 years ago, watching as the lights went out. When the vision ended, I was alone in my apartment again. But everything had changed. The frost on the windows had formed words. "Remember me." The newspaper clipping lay on the coffee table, but now the missing name was visible, written in condensation that couldn't possibly exist in the warm room. I staggered backward, my mind reeling with implications I didn't want to accept. The memories were returning now, unbidden and unwelcome. The opportunity, the moment of weakness, the careful disposal of evidence, the transfer to a new city, a new job, a new life built on the foundation of a secret I had buried so deep I had convinced myself it never happened. But she remembered. In whatever place between life and death she inhabited, she remembered everything, and she had found me. The next morning I woke to find muddy footprints leading from the front door to the corner where she always appeared. The prints were small, delicate, and they stopped abruptly at the wall, as if whoever made them had simply walked through solid matter. I followed the trail backward to my door, which was still locked from the inside. The prints led to the threshold but went no further, ending at the exact point where invitation would be required, where permission would need to be granted. That's when I understood the true horror of my situation. She wasn't just visiting during the blackouts. She was asking to come in. Each appearance, each reaching gesture, was a request for entry into the world of the living. And somehow, through guilt or recognition, or the inexorable pull of justice, I was weakening. The barriers between us were dissolving. Now, as I sit here writing this account, I can feel the familiar electrical charge building in the air. The tapping has started at the window, more urgent than ever before. My hands are shaking as I type, and my breath is beginning to fog in the rapidly cooling air. The lights are starting to flicker. I know that when the darkness comes this time, it will be different. The reaching hand will find its target, and the boundary between her world and mine will finally collapse. Whether that means justice, vengeance, or something else entirely, I cannot say. But I can hear her breathing now, even with the lights still on, synchronized perfectly with my own terrified gasps. She's learning to exist in the light, to manifest without the cover of darkness. The temperature is dropping faster now, and ice is forming on the keys as I type. Soon, very soon, she will step fully into this world, and I will have to answer for what I did in that basement 3 years ago. The tapping has stopped. The lights are fading. She's here. Story 8. The realtor had called it a charming starter home, but standing in the living room at 3 in the morning, listening to footsteps that shouldn't exist, I wondered what twisted sense of charm she'd been selling. The sound came from upstairs again, deliberate measured steps crossing the hallway above my head. Each footfall landed with the weight of purpose, as if someone who belonged there was making their nightly rounds. But I lived alone now. Had lived alone for the past 6 weeks since moving into this place on Elm Street, a modest 2-story colonial that the previous owners had abandoned after only 8 months of residence. I should have asked more questions about why they'd left so quickly. The footsteps paused directly above me, and in that silence, the house seemed to hold its breath. The old hardwood floors that had creaked pleasantly under my weight during the day now felt like a thin barrier between me and something that had no business being there. I pressed my back against the couch, staring at the ceiling, counting seconds that stretched like hours. Then the stereo exploded to life. The volume dial twisted itself to maximum, flooding the room with a wall of static that made my teeth ache. I lunged for the power button, my heart hammering against my ribs. But even after I'd yanked the plug from the wall, the white noise continued for another 3 seconds before dying with the electronic wheeze. My hands trembled as I examined the cord. Definitely unplugged. Definitely impossible. But impossible had become a frequent visitor since I'd moved in. It had started small. Doors that I remembered closing found open in the morning. The occasional creak that might have been the house settling. Normal things that any rational person would dismiss as the quirks of an older home. I'd been rational once. I'd been a lot of things once. Before the divorce, before the layoffs, before I'd ended up in this place that I could barely afford, surrounded by boxes I couldn't bring myself to unpack completely because some part of me knew I wouldn't be staying long. The footsteps resumed, but now they were descending the stairs. Each step was distinct, purposeful, accompanied by the soft whisper of a hand trailing along the banister. I could picture it perfectly. Fingers sliding along the worn wood that I'd touched countless times myself. Except these fingers belonged to someone who cast no shadow, left no fingerprints, and existed in the spaces between my certainty and my fear. I forced myself to stand, to walk to the bottom of the staircase, and look up into the darkness of the second floor. The steps had stopped, but the air felt charged, as if something stood just beyond the reach of the streetlight filtering through the landing window. Hello? The word escaped before I could stop it, hanging in the air like an admission of madness. The house answered with silence. I climbed the stairs, my bare feet finding every creak that the phantom footsteps had somehow avoided. The hallway stretched before me, doors on either side leading to the spare room, the bathroom, and at the far end, the bedroom that had once been intended for a child. The previous owners had left behind a few items: a rocking chair in the spare room, some built-in shelves, and in that far bedroom, glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to the ceiling in constellation patterns I didn't recognize. The door to that room stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it before going downstairs. I'd made a point of closing it every night, not because of any logical reason, but because something about that room made my skin crawl. The way the shadows seemed deeper there, the way the air felt thicker, as if it held the memory of smaller lungs breathing it. I pushed the door open wider and immediately wished I hadn't. The alarm clock on the nightstand was ringing, not a gentle wake-up chime, but the harsh mechanical shrieking of an old-fashioned alarm clock, the kind with twin bells on top that hammered against each other with desperate urgency. The sound filled the room, bounced off the walls, and drove into my skull like nails, but the clock was unplugged. Had been unplugged since the day I'd moved in, when I'd found it sitting there like a forgotten relic from the previous tenants' lives. I'd pulled the cord from the wall myself, wrapped it around the base, and left it sitting there because I couldn't bring myself to throw away something that didn't belong to me. Now it screamed at me with mechanical fury, its hands spinning wildly as if time itself had gone insane. I grabbed it, my fingers fumbling for the switch on the back, but the alarm continued even as I held the silent mechanism in my hands. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off surfaces that shouldn't exist, bouncing back from corners that geometry insisted were impossible. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ringing stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware of something else, a presence standing behind me. I felt it before I saw it, the way you feel a storm approaching even when the sky is clear. The air temperature dropped several degrees, and my breath began to mist. The hair on the back of my neck rose, and every primitive instinct I possessed screamed at me to run. Instead, I turned around. The shadow stood in the doorway, tall and unmistakably human in shape, but wrong in every detail that mattered. It had substance without form, depth without dimension. When it moved, and it was moving, shifting weight from one foot to the other in a mockery of casual observation, it didn't disturb the air around it. No displacement, no sound. Just the horrible certainty that something that shouldn't be there was watching me with interest I couldn't comprehend. We regarded each other across the small room, predator and prey, though I wasn't sure which was which. The shadow had no features I could distinguish, no eyes that I could see. But I felt its attention like a physical weight pressing against my chest. It tilted its head slightly, the gesture almost curious, as if trying to understand what I was doing in its space. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? Its space. I was the intruder here, the temporary occupant of a place that belonged to something else. Something that had been here before the previous owners, before the owners before them, waiting with infinite patience for the right moment to make itself known. The shadow stepped into the room. It moved without sound, without the displacement of air that should have accompanied something of its apparent mass. One moment it filled the doorway, the next it stood beside the bed, close enough that if it had been corporeal, I could have reached out and touched it. I didn't want to touch it. Every cell in my body recoiled from the idea of contact with that thing, as if it carried some contagion that would spread through skin and bone and soul until there was nothing left of me but shadow. But I couldn't move, couldn't run, could barely breathe. The shadow raised what might have been a hand and pointed toward the window that overlooked the backyard. Following its gesture, I saw the yard as I'd never seen it before. Not empty, but filled with shapes that stood perfectly still among the trees. Dozens of them, maybe more, all human in silhouette but wrong in the same fundamental way as the thing beside me. They were all looking up at the window, looking up at me. How long had they been there? How long had they been waiting? I turned back to address the shadow beside me, to demand answers or explanations or at least acknowledgement that what was happening defied every rational law I'd ever accepted. But the room was empty. The shadow was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of something I couldn't identify. something old and patient and utterly alien. The alarm clock on the nightstand showed 3:33 a.m., its hands pointing accusingly at numbers that seemed significant in ways I didn't want to understand. The cord remained wrapped around its base, but when I checked the wall outlet, I found scratches in the paint around the socket, as if something had been plugged and unplugged there many times. I went to the window and looked down at the backyard again. Empty. Just grass and trees and the privacy fence that I'd thought provided security. But shadows, I was learning, didn't need gates or doors or any of the conventional barriers that kept the world divided between inside and outside, safe and dangerous, real and impossible. Over the following nights, the activity escalated. Footsteps became a nightly occurrence, pacing back and forth above my head with the rhythm of someone keeping watch. The stereo developed a habit of turning itself on at random hours, always tuned to static, always at volumes that made the windows shake. The alarm clock in the upstairs bedroom rang at 3:33 every morning, regardless of whether I'd removed it from the house entirely. I started keeping a journal, documenting each incident with the methodical precision of someone trying to prove their sanity through the accumulation of evidence. But the pages filled with accounts that no reasonable person would believe, and I began to suspect that I was creating a record not of supernatural occurrences, but of my own deteriorating mental state. Sleep became elusive. When I did manage to drift off, I'd wake to find myself standing in different rooms, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Once I found myself in the backyard at dawn, still in my pajamas, staring up at the bedroom window where a shadow seemed to be looking down at me. I started seeing the shadows everywhere, not just in the house, but following me to work, standing at the edges of parking lots, waiting at bus stops where no buses came. They never approached during daylight hours, but their presence was constant, patient, as if they knew something I didn't about the inevitable conclusion of our relationship. My coworkers began to comment on my appearance. I'd lost weight, they said. I looked tired. Was everything all right at home? How could I explain that home had become a battlefield where the laws of physics went to die? How could I tell them that I was living in a place where electronic devices obeyed rules I didn't understand, where my presence seemed to be tolerated rather than welcomed, where something ancient and patient was slowly making itself known? I researched the house's history, diving into property records and newspaper archives with the desperation of someone looking for rational explanations in an increasingly irrational world. The trail of owners stretched back decades, but the pattern was consistent: short-term occupancy, sudden departures, properties abandoned or sold far below market value. One family had lived there for only 3 months. Another had lasted 6 weeks. The longest previous occupancy had been 11 months, and that family had left so abruptly that they'd abandoned most of their possessions. I found a newspaper article from 1987 about a gas leak that had forced the evacuation of several houses on Elm Street. The report mentioned unexplained electrical disturbances and resident complaints of unusual phenomena in the days leading up to the leak. The gas company had found no mechanical cause for the leak, and the article noted that city inspectors had been unable to explain the electrical problems that had plagued the neighborhood for weeks. But there was something else in the article that made my blood run cold. In the background of a photograph showing evacuation efforts, I could see my house clearly. And there, standing in the upstairs window, the same window I'd been looking out of when I saw the shapes in the yard, was a dark silhouette that the camera had captured, but the photographer had apparently not noticed. The shadow had been there for at least 38 years, maybe longer. That night I sat in the living room with every light in the house blazing, waiting for 3:33 a.m. and whatever revelation it might bring. I'd decided that I needed to confront whatever was sharing my space, to demand answers, or at least understanding. The footsteps began at 3:15, right on schedule. But this time, they didn't stop at the usual patrol route. They came down the stairs, each step deliberate and unhurried, and crossed the living room floor toward where I sat frozen on the couch. I couldn't see anything. The room remained empty despite the sound of approaching footsteps, but I felt a presence settle into the chair across from me. The cushions compressed under invisible weight, and the air grew thick with the scent of something old and forgotten. We sat together in silence, the shadow and I, while the minutes ticked past on my watch. And gradually, As my terror gave way to a strange kind of acceptance, I began to understand what it wanted. It wasn't malevolent. It wasn't trying to harm me or drive me away. It was simply curious. After decades of brief human visitors who fled before any real communication could be established, it had found someone willing to stay long enough to listen. The alarm clock upstairs began its nightly shrieking, but this time I didn't flinch. The stereo joined in with its chorus of static, but the sound seemed almost conversational now, like white noise that carried meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension. And in that cacophony of impossible sounds, I heard something that might have been a voice. Not words exactly, but something that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to the part of my mind that existed before reason, before logic, before the need to understand everything could be categorized and explained. It had been alone for so long. The house had been its prison and its sanctuary, its boundary and its identity. Previous owners had sensed its presence and fled, unable to accept the reality of something that existed in the spaces between their understanding and their fear. But I was different. I was desperate enough, broken enough, isolated enough to recognize a kindred spirit, even when it wore the shape of shadow and impossibility. As the sounds faded and the presence across from me began to withdraw, I understood that I had a choice. I could leave, as all the others had, carrying with me the memory of something that defied explanation. I could convince myself that stress and isolation had created phantoms where none existed, that rational explanations could be found for everything I'd experienced. Or I could stay. I could accept that the world was larger and stranger than I'd ever imagined, that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, but simply acknowledged. I could choose companionship over comprehension, presence over proof. The shadow stood, and I felt rather than saw it move toward the stairs. But it paused at the bottom step and turned back toward me, and in that moment of attention, I felt something that might have been gratitude. I'm still here. It's been 3 months since that night, and the house has become something different. The footsteps still come, but they're companionable now, like having a roommate who keeps different hours. The stereo plays its static songs, but only when I'm feeling too alone, as if something understands the particular weight of silence. The alarm clock rings at 3:33, but it's become a comfort rather than a terror, a reminder that I'm not as isolated as I sometimes feel. My coworkers still comment on my appearance, but now they say I look better, healthier, more settled. They ask about my new place, and I tell them it's perfect, that I found exactly what I was looking for. And that's true even though what I was looking for wasn't what I thought I needed. Sometimes, late at night when the rest of the world is asleep, I sit in the living room and listen to the sounds of my housemate moving through the rooms above. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, or notice that a book has been moved to a different shelf, or find that someone has closed a window I'd left open. I've stopped trying to photograph or document these occurrences. Some experiences lose their meaning when subjected to proof, and I've learned that there are different kinds of truth than the ones that can be measured or verified. The neighbors think I'm the longest-term resident this house has ever had. They don't know that I'm not the only one living here, that I'm sharing the space with something that has been patient for longer than any human has the right to expect. But sometimes, when I'm working in the yard or checking the mail, I notice how they hurry past my house, how they don't quite look directly at the windows, how their children cross to the other side of the street when they ride their bikes past my front gate. And I wonder if they see the shadows too, if they sense the presence that I've learned to live with. I wonder if they know that the figure sometimes visible in the upstairs window isn't always me. I wonder if they understand that some houses choose their inhabitants as much as inhabitants choose their houses, and that sometimes the most important question isn't whether something is real, but whether you're brave enough to accept it either way. The alarm clock is ringing again. It's 3:33 a.m., and my housemate is making its rounds. Soon the stereo will join in with its nightly chorus, and I'll sit here listening to sounds that exist in the space between explanation and experience, between the possible and the impossible. And I'll be grateful for the company, even if I'm never entirely sure whether the shadows I'm living with are outside my mind or inside it. Because in the end, does it really matter? The footsteps have stopped directly above me, and I can feel attention focused down through the ceiling like a warm weight. Tomorrow, I'll find that the books on my shelf have been rearranged, or that a window I'd left closed has been opened to let in the morning air. Small gestures from a presence that has learned to be gentle with the human who finally chose to stay. I'm not afraid anymore. Haven't been for weeks now. Fear has been replaced by something stranger and more complex. An acceptance of mystery that feels like coming home. The stereo is starting to hum, preparing for its nightly performance. And upstairs, in the room with the glow-in-the-dark stars, something that might be grateful is settling in for another night of peaceful coexistence with the human who decided that being alone with impossible company was better than being alone with only the possible. The alarm clock's ringing grows louder, but it doesn't sound like a warning anymore. It sounds like a lullaby. Story 9. The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., cutting through the stale coffee taste in my mouth and the oppressive silence of the patrol car. Another welfare check. Another suspected relapse. I'd been working these streets for 12 years, and the calls always came in the dead hours when the city's wounds festered in the darkness. The address led me to a run-down apartment complex on the east side, where the streetlights flickered like dying insects and shadows pooled in doorways like spilled ink. My partner had called in sick that night, the third time this month, leaving me to handle the call alone. The building superintendent met me at the entrance, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. "Been hearing things all week," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. Laughing, always laughing. The other tenants, they're complaining, saying it keeps them up at night. The elevator wheezed and groaned as we climbed to the 4th floor. With each passing floor, the air seemed to grow thicker, pressing against my lungs like wet cotton. The fluorescent lights above us hummed with an electric intensity that made my teeth ache. By the time we reached the target apartment, I could hear it too. A low, rhythmic sound that might have been laughter or might have been something else entirely. The superintendent's master key turned with a grinding protest. The door swung open, revealing a slice of darkness that seemed to swallow the hallway's dim light. The smell hit me first. Copper and salt and something organic that made my stomach lurch. Then came the heat, rolling out of the apartment like breath from some massive hidden lung. He was sitting in the center of the living room when I found him, cross-legged on the bare hardwood floor, surrounded by what looked like medical gauze and dark stains that I tried not to examine too closely. His head was tilted back, eyes rolled toward the ceiling, and that grin, God, that grin stretched across his face like a wound. Sweat poured down his skin in rivulets, catching the light from my flashlight in ways that made him look almost luminous. "Sir?" My voice came out hoarser than intended. "Sir, I need you to respond." His head rolled toward me with a motion that seemed too fluid, too loose. The grin never wavered. His eyes, when they found mine, were completely black, pupils dilated so wide that no iris remained visible. In that darkness, I thought I saw movement, like something swimming just beneath the surface. The apartment around him told a story I couldn't quite piece together. Furniture pushed against the walls as if to create a perfect circle in the center of the room. The windows were covered with newspaper, layer upon layer, blocking out any hint of the world beyond. Symbols were scratched into the walls, not carved, but scraped with fingernails, based on the dried blood under each groove. They formed patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric impossibilities that seemed to shift when I wasn't focusing on them. I called for backup, my radio producing only static in response. The superintendent had vanished sometime after opening the door, leaving me alone with the grinning man and the overwhelming sense that I was being watched by more than just his empty black eyes. "What's your name?" I tried again, taking a step closer despite every instinct screaming at me to retreat. His mouth opened, but instead of words, more laughter spilled out. That same rhythmic sound I'd heard through the door, but now I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards and up into my bones. The sound had weight to it, substance, as if it were a living thing crawling into my ears and nesting there. That's when I noticed the photographs. They covered the coffee table beside him, scattered like playing cards. Polaroids, dozens of them, all showing the same thing. Me, walking to my car, entering the police station, sitting in this very apartment building's parking lot just minutes ago. In some of the photos, there were shadows behind me that I didn't remember seeing, shapes that looked almost human but were somehow wrong, elongated and bent at impossible angles. My hand moved instinctively to my service weapon, but something stopped me. In the furthest corner of the room, barely visible in the shifting light of my flashlight, I saw it. A camera on a tripod, its lens pointing directly at where I stood. The red recording light blinked steadily, capturing everything. "You've been waiting for me," I said, and it wasn't a question. The grinning man's head bobbed in what might have been a nod. His lips moved, forming words without sound, and I found myself leaning closer to try to read them. That's when I realized the copper smell wasn't just blood. It was something else. Something that reminded me of pennies held too long in sweaty palms, of metal left to rust in damp basements. The scratches on the walls began to make sense as I stared at them. Not symbols at all, but letters. Letters repeated over and over in different configurations, spelling out words in a language I couldn't identify but somehow understood. They spoke of watching, of waiting, of transformation and revelation. They spoke of the thin places where reality grew soft and something else could push through. I backed toward the door, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The grinning man's laughter grew louder, more insistent, and I realized that other voices had joined it. They came from the walls, from the ceiling, from the spaces between the floorboards. A chorus of amusement that seemed to find my fear endlessly entertaining. My radio buzzed suddenly, startling me. The voice that came through was mine. Unit 47 responding to welfare check. Everything appears normal. Subject is stable and cooperative. I never made that call. The grinning man's eyes rolled back to focus on me, and for the first time, his expression changed. The grin widened, stretching until it seemed to split his face in half. Behind his teeth, I saw not the pink of a human mouth but darkness, the same swimming, infinite darkness that had filled his eyes. "Time to go," he said, and his voice was exactly like mine. I stumbled backward, finally breaking whatever spell had held me in place. The hallway behind me stretched longer than it should have, the elevator seeming miles away. Behind me, the laughter followed, growing louder and more complex, as if an entire audience had gathered to watch my retreat. The elevator doors opened before I reached them, revealing the superintendent. He looked older than before, his hair whiter, his skin more lined. He smiled when he saw me, the same impossible grin I'd just left behind. "All finished with your visit?" he asked pleasantly. I pressed myself against the far wall of the elevator, watching the floor numbers descend. 3rd floor, 2nd, 1st. But the door didn't open when we reached the lobby. Instead, the elevator continued down, the display showing a symbol I didn't recognize. Then another, then a sequence of marks that hurt my eyes to follow. "Where are we going?" I managed to ask. The superintendent's grin never wavered. "Same place we always go." The elevator finally stopped with a grinding screech. The doors opened onto a vast underground space that couldn't possibly exist beneath the small apartment building. Rows upon rows of chairs faced a central stage, and in each chair sat a figure. Some were in police uniforms identical to mine. Others wore the clothes of paramedics, firefighters, social workers. All of them had the same black eyes, the same terrible grin. They began to applaud as I stepped out of the elevator, a sound like breaking glass that echoed off walls that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. On the stage, a figure stood behind a podium. As I watched, it reached up and pulled off its face like a mask, revealing the familiar features of the man from the apartment. "Welcome," it said in my voice, "to your performance review." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Looking down, I saw that my feet were no longer touching the ground. I was floating, being pulled forward by invisible strings toward the stage where my doppelganger waited with patient amusement. That's when I woke up. Or at least, I think I did. I was in my patrol car, parked outside the apartment building. My radio was silent. The clock on the dashboard read 3:47 a.m. Through the windshield, I could see a figure in a 4th-floor window, barely visible behind layers of newspaper. It was waving at me. I checked my logbook. No calls had come in that night, no welfare check, no suspected relapse. According to every record I could find, I'd been parked outside this building for the past 4 hours, doing nothing but staring up at that window. But in my pocket, I found a Polaroid photograph. It showed me sleeping in my car, taken from somewhere high above. In the background, barely visible, were shapes that might have been clouds, or might have been something else entirely. Something watching, something waiting. I drive past that building every night now, and the figure is always there, waving from behind the newspaper-covered glass. Sometimes I think I can hear laughter drifting down from the 4th floor, the same rhythmic sound that seems to sync perfectly with my heartbeat. My partner has been calling in sick more frequently. Other officers on the force have begun avoiding me, though they can't seem to explain why. And every morning I find new photographs in my pockets. Images of places I don't remember visiting, moments I don't remember living. The grinning man is in all of them, standing just behind my shoulder, just outside my peripheral vision. I've started to wonder if that night ever really ended, or if I'm still sitting in that impossible theater beneath the city, watching my own performance from the audience while something else wears my face and walks my beat. The only thing I know for certain is that the laughter never stops. Even now, as I write this, I can hear it echoing through the walls of my apartment, through the spaces between thoughts, through the thin places where one reality bleeds into another. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in unexpected mirrors, I see that I'm grinning too. Story 10. The wire shouldn't have been there. 3 days into our backcountry hydrology survey, knee-deep in stream measurements and soil samples, and there it was. A black electrical cable snaking through the underbrush like some technological parasite feeding on the wilderness. My cousin crouched beside it, his weathered fingers tracing its path through the moss and fallen leaves. "Power line," he muttered, though we both knew that made no sense. We were 40 miles from the nearest road, 70 from any settlement worth the name. The Forest Service maps showed nothing but unmarked wilderness stretching for days in every direction. The cable was modern, heavy-gauge wire with intact insulation that looked maybe a year old at most. It emerged from beneath a rotting log and disappeared into a thicket of serviceberry and wild rose, heading roughly northwest toward the ridgeline. Everything about it felt wrong. Not just its presence, but the way it seemed to hum with purpose even in this place forgotten by civilization. I suggested we ignore it, focus on our work. We had water samples to collect, flow rates to measure, a government contract to fulfill. But my cousin had that look he got sometimes, the same expression that had led us into trouble as kids. Curiosity mixed with something darker, more compulsive. "Won't take long," he said, shouldering his pack. "Just want to see where it goes." The rational part of my mind screamed warnings as we followed the wire deeper into the forest. Every step took us further from our planned route, further from the logical world of scientific methodology and documented phenomena. But there was something hypnotic about that black line cutting through the wilderness, something that demanded answers even as it promised none that would bring comfort. The cable led us uphill through stands of lodgepole pine so thick they blocked most of the afternoon sun. Shadows pooled in the spaces between trees, and more than once I caught movement in my peripheral vision, quick darting shapes that vanished when I turned to look. My cousin seemed oblivious, or maybe he was just better at ignoring the feeling that we were being observed by something that shouldn't exist in this empty place. After an hour of climbing, the wire led us into a clearing perhaps 30 feet across. The space felt unnatural, too perfectly circular, the grass too green and uniform. At the center sat the most impossible thing I had ever seen: a school desk. Not just any desk, but the kind I remembered from childhood. Brown laminate surface scarred with decades of pencil marks and carved initials, attached metal chair with that particular squeak of institutional furniture. It sat there in the middle of the wilderness like it had grown from the soil, completely out of place yet somehow rooted, permanent. The wire terminated at a standard electrical outlet mounted on the side of the desk. The outlet was live, A small red LED glowed steadily in the darkness of its metal housing. My cousin approached slowly, his footsteps muffled by the strange grass that seemed to absorb sound. "Jesus," he whispered, and the word hung in the air like a prayer in a language neither of us remembered how to speak. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and walk away, to pretend we had never found this place. But my cousin was already circling the desk, examining it with the methodical attention he usually reserved for geological samples. He ran his fingers along the surface, noting the carved names and dates that should have meant something to someone, somewhere. The dates were wrong, all of them. Some reached back decades into the past, others stretched years into the future. My cousin called out names and dates as he found them, his voice growing smaller with each discovery. The carvings looked authentic, weathered by time and use, but they spoke of times that hadn't happened yet, or students who should have been adults by now. I pulled out my GPS unit, more from habit than any real hope of understanding. The screen flickered, showing our location as a blank space between established coordinates. According to the device, we were standing in the middle of empty wilderness, exactly where the map said we should be. But maps didn't account for school desks, powered by impossible wires in clearings that felt carved from reality itself. My cousin sat in the chair. I wanted to stop him, but the words died in my throat as he settled against the metal back with a sound like settling bones. He looked natural there, like he belonged, like the desk had been waiting specifically for him. The thought made my skin crawl. "Remember Mrs. Henderson's class?" he asked suddenly. "Third grade. You sat 2 rows behind me." I did remember, but not until he mentioned it. The memory felt rusty, unused, like something I had deliberately forgotten. Mrs. Henderson, with her chalk-dusty hands and patient smile, the way sunlight slanted through tall windows in the afternoon. The particular smell of old paper and floor wax that marked every school day. "We're not in school," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. My cousin opened the desk. The hinges moved silently, revealing an interior that should have been empty but wasn't. Inside lay a composition notebook, its marbled black and white cover familiar in a way that made my chest tight. He lifted it out carefully, as if it might dissolve at his touch. The first page was covered in handwriting I recognized as my own, though I had no memory of writing the words. Neat cursive lines describing our hydrology work, our camping locations, the exact route we had taken to reach this clearing. But the account was written in past tense, as if the events had already concluded, and it included details we hadn't shared with anyone. Private conversations, small moments of doubt and frustration that existed only between us. My cousin flipped through more pages. The handwriting changed, becoming his own, then mine again, then something else entirely. Lesson plans written in a flowing script that belonged to no teacher I remembered. Mathematical equations that hurt to look at directly. Drawings of the clearing made with careful precision, showing details that were accurate down to the specific arrangement of stones around the perimeter. The afternoon light was fading, though my watch insisted it was barely past 2 o'clock. Shadows stretched across the clearing in directions that didn't correspond to the sun's position, and the air had grown thick with the kind of humidity that comes before storms, though the sky remained perfectly clear. I suggested we leave. The words came out as barely a whisper, but my cousin heard them. He looked up from the notebook with an expression I had never seen before. Not quite confusion, not quite fear, but something that lived in the space between knowing and understanding. "We can't," he said simply. "Not yet." "Why not?" He gestured to the notebook, to pages filled with our own handwriting describing events that seemed to exist in some parallel timeline, where our scientific expedition had led us inevitably to this place. "We haven't finished the lesson." That was when I noticed the sounds. Not the absence of sound that characterizes deep wilderness, but the presence of something else entirely. Distant voices carrying conversations in words I almost understood. The squeak of metal chair legs against linoleum floors. The scratch of pencils on paper, and the whispered sharing of secrets between students who should not exist. My cousin had returned to reading the notebook, his lips moving silently as he traced words with his finger. His face was changing, becoming younger somehow, taking on the soft uncertainty of childhood. When he looked up at me, his eyes held the wide expectancy of a student waiting for instruction. "Sir," he said, and the word hit me like cold water. "What's the assignment?" I backed away from the desk, my boots catching on the too perfect grass. The clearing felt smaller now, the trees pressing closer, and I realized with growing horror that I could no longer see the wire that had led us here. The black cable had vanished, leaving us stranded in this impossible place with no clear path back to the world we knew. My cousin remained seated, patient and attentive, while shadows moved between the trees at the clearing's edge. Not animal shadows. These had the upright posture and deliberate movement of people who belonged to different time, different circumstances entirely. They watched without revealing themselves, waiting for something I didn't understand and wasn't sure I wanted to. The notebook was open to a new page now, blank except for a single line at the top written in my own careful handwriting. Document your observations of anomalous electromagnetic phenomena in Grid Section 7 Alpha. I had never written those words. Grid Section 7. Alpha didn't exist on any of our maps. But as I stared at the page, more words began to appear beneath the first line, forming themselves in my familiar script as if guided by some invisible hand. The writing described our journey to the clearing in precise scientific language, cataloging details and measurements with the detached accuracy of a field report. The words were true, all of them, but they described a version of events I didn't remember living, a parallel expedition where we had come here intentionally, following established protocols for investigating unexplained phenomena. In this other timeline, the desk was expected, the wire was part of our equipment, and the clearing was marked on classified maps as a site of ongoing research. My cousin stood up from the chair, his movements slow and dreamlike. When he faced me, his expression had changed again, becoming older now, more serious. He looked like our grandfather had in old photographs, stern and purposeful, carrying responsibilities I couldn't begin to imagine. "The data needs to be recorded," he said in a voice that sounded like his own, but carried different weight, different authority. "That's why we're here." I wanted to argue, to insist that we were hydrologists on a routine survey, that none of this made sense, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself approaching the desk, drawn by the same compulsion that had led us to follow the wire in the first place. The notebook lay open, waiting, its pages filled with increasingly detailed accounts of our presence in this place that existed between what was real and what was possible. Darkness was falling now, though the clearing remained somehow illuminated by soft light that seemed to emanate from the grass itself. The shadows at the tree line had grown bolder, revealing glimpses of figures in familiar clothing, Park Service uniforms, research equipment, the casual gear of field scientists like ourselves. They moved with purpose but without urgency, as if they had all the time in the world to complete whatever work had brought them here. The notebook showed new entries appearing on each page. I turned, written in dozens of different hands, but all describing the same essential experience: the discovery of the wire, the journey to the clearing, the moment of recognition that some places exist outside the normal flow of time and circumstance. Each account was signed with names I didn't recognize, dates that spanned decades, but the details remained consistent across every entry. My cousin took the notebook from my hands gently, almost reverently. He found a blank page near the back and began to write, his movements precise and deliberate. I watched my name appear under his pen, along with the date and a brief description of our official reason for being in this area. Below that, he started documenting our discovery of the desk, using language that was both clinical and somehow reverent. As he wrote, I became aware that the sounds from the forest had changed. The whispered conversations had grown clearer, resolving into specific words and phrases that dealt with data collection, observation protocols, and the careful documentation of anomalous events. These were the voices of researchers like ourselves, scientists who had found their way to this clearing across different years, different decades, all drawn by the same impossible wire leading to the same inexplicable destination. The realization hit me with the force of physical impact. We weren't the first to discover this place. We weren't even the most recent. The desk, the notebook, the careful documentation, it was all part of an ongoing study that existed outside normal time, conducted by researchers who came here and found themselves unable to leave until they had completed their assigned observations. My cousin finished writing and looked up at me with eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated knowledge. He closed the notebook carefully and placed it back inside the desk, then stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. For a moment I thought he was going to leave, to find the path back to our normal timeline and our routine scientific work. Instead, he stopped at the tree line and began unpacking his equipment. His movements were methodical, practiced, as if he had performed this ritual many times before. He set up our instruments in a careful pattern around the clearing's perimeter, creating a monitoring station that looked professional and permanent. I found myself helping without conscious decision. My hands knew what to do, even though my mind recoiled from the implications. We established measurement points, calibrated sensors, and began recording data about electromagnetic fluctuations, gravitational anomalies, and temporal distortions that our equipment shouldn't have been sophisticated enough to detect. The work felt familiar, even comforting. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time moved differently here, flowing at variable speeds that corresponded to the intensity of our observations. The figures in the trees had emerged fully now, revealing themselves as researchers from different eras, all working on aspects of the same impossible project. Some wore clothing I recognized as contemporary, others dressed in styles that suggested different decades. They moved between monitoring stations positioned throughout the forest, collecting data with equipment that ranged from familiar modern instruments to devices I couldn't identify. All of them worked with the same focused intensity, the same dedication to documenting phenomena that existed beyond conventional understanding. As dawn approached, though the light came from directions that didn't correspond to any possible sun position, I realized that we had become part of something larger than our original mission. The hydrology survey was finished, completed in ways that would satisfy our government contracts and academic requirements. But our real work was just beginning. The desk sat at the center of it all, patient and permanent, its electrical outlet still glowing with steady red light. The wire that had led us here was visible again, snaking away into the forest to connect with other impossible cables, other monitoring stations, other clearings where researchers like ourselves discovered that reality had more rooms than they had ever imagined. My cousin was making final notations in a field journal that looked decades older than it should have. His handwriting had evolved throughout the night, becoming more precise, more confident, as if he was remembering skills he had never learned. When he finished, he showed me the page. Detailed measurements and observations that would take the scientific community decades to understand, assuming they ever gained access to our data. "The work continues," he said simply, and I understood that he wasn't talking about our hydrology survey. We packed our personal equipment but left the monitoring station in place. Other researchers would find it, add their own observations, contribute to the accumulated knowledge that grew like coral around this strange nexus point. The notebook in the desk would continue to fill with new accounts, new discoveries, new questions that demanded investigation. As we walked back into the forest, following paths that led toward the world of routine scientific inquiry and government contracts, I looked back once at the clearing. The desk was barely visible through the trees, but its presence remained solid and undeniable. Somewhere behind us, the red light continued to glow, marking a place where time moved in circles and reality bent to accommodate impossible truths. My cousin walked ahead of me, his step lighter than it had been in years. He was whistling softly, a tune I almost recognized from somewhere I couldn't quite remember. Our GPS units showed normal readings now, indicating our exact position on familiar maps that accounted for every tree and stream in this carefully documented wilderness. But I knew we would be back. The work demanded it, and the desk would be waiting, patient as always, ready to accommodate the next researchers who followed impossible wires to impossible destinations. The red light would guide them, just as it had guided us, to a place where observation and documentation took on meanings that transcended ordinary science. The wire was gone when I looked for it again, vanished back into whatever parallel timeline had produced it. But sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I could still see that black line cutting through the underbrush, still feel its electromagnetic hum calling me toward discoveries that existed just beyond the edge of everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. Story 11. The wallpaper in my childhood bedroom still bears those same faded roses, their petals now brown and curling at the edges like ancient secrets. I stand here 30 years later, in the house where everything began to unravel, feeling the weight of memory pressing against my skull like a tumor of doubt. It was the summer I turned 8 that my grandfather came to stay with us. The old man had been living alone since my grandmother passed, and my mother insisted he shouldn't be isolated in that drafty farmhouse 20 miles outside town. He arrived on a Tuesday with nothing but a worn leather suitcase and the peculiar smell that seemed to follow him everywhere, a mixture of pipe tobacco, mothballs, and something else I could never quite identify, something that made my nostrils twitch and my stomach flutter with unease. My parents set him up in the guest room adjacent to mine, the one with the thin walls that carried every creak of floorboards, every whispered conversation, every restless movement through the long nights. From the moment he settled in, the house felt different, smaller somehow, as if his presence had compressed the very air we breathed. Grandfather was a tall man with silver hair that caught lamplight in ways that made shadows dance across his gaunt features. His eyes were the color of winter mornings, pale and distant, and when he looked at me, I felt as though he was seeing something just beyond my shoulder. He spoke in measured tones, each word carefully selected and delivered with a precision that made ordinary conversations feel like formal ceremonies. The first week passed without incident, though I found myself staying closer to my parents when he was around. There was nothing overtly threatening about the man. He never raised his voice, never made sudden movements, never did anything that would alarm my mother or father. Yet something in my 8-year-old instincts recoiled from him, the way a small animal might sense an approaching storm. It was the way he watched me during dinner, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth while his pale eyes tracked my movements. The way he appeared in doorways without warning, materializing from shadows like smoke taking human form. The way he had of humming under his breath, always the same tuneless melody that seemed to vibrate through the walls long after he'd gone to bed. My sleep became fragmented during those early days. I would wake to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, pausing outside my door for what felt like hours before continuing on. When I mentioned it to my mother, she dismissed my concerns with the tired smile she reserved for my more imaginative fears. Old houses made noises, she explained. Grandfather was probably just restless, adjusting to a new environment. But I knew the difference between settling wood and human movement. These footsteps had intention behind them, a purpose that made my skin crawl beneath my summer pajamas. The second week brought a change in routine. Grandfather began visiting my room each night before I went to sleep, settling into the old rocking chair beside my bed with a book of ghost stories that had belonged to my father as a child. His voice, when he read, transformed into something entirely different, softer, almost hypnotic, weaving tales of spectral encounters and otherworldly visitations that left me simultaneously terrified and entranced. The stories themselves weren't particularly frightening by daylight standards, but in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, with shadows stretching across the ceiling like grasping fingers, they took on a weight that pressed against my chest. Grandfather's pale eyes would occasionally lift from the pages to meet mine, and in those moments I felt as though I was falling into something vast and cold. He would always end our sessions the same way, closing the book with a soft thud that seemed to echo longer than it should, rising from the rocking chair with joints that creaked like old hinges, and leaning down to press his lips against my forehead. The kiss was brief, but lingered with that strange smell I could never identify, leaving my skin feeling oddly cold long after he'd left the room. The dreams started immediately. At first, they were fragmented things, glimpses of movement in peripheral vision, whispered voices speaking words I couldn't quite understand, the sensation of being watched by eyes I couldn't locate. But as the nights progressed, the dreams became more vivid, more coherent, and infinitely more disturbing. I would find myself standing in a vast, empty house that was somehow both familiar and completely alien. The walls were covered in the same faded rose wallpaper as my bedroom, but they stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. Footsteps echoed from unseen corridors, always approaching but never arriving, and somewhere in the distance that tuneless humming grew louder and more insistent. In these dreams, I was always searching for something, or someone, though I could never remember what. I would wander through endless rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets, each piece concealing shapes that might have been human, or might have been something else entirely. The air was thick with dust motes that moved with too much purpose, swirling in patterns that hurt to follow. And always, there was the presence behind me, never close enough to touch, never distant enough to ignore. I could feel its attention like ice water trickling down my spine, could sense its amusement at my growing panic. When I would finally work up the courage to turn around, I would wake to find my bedroom exactly as I'd left it, though the smell of pipe tobacco and mothballs seemed stronger than before. During the day, I tried to convince myself that these were just the natural result of too many ghost stories and an overactive imagination. Children had nightmares. It was practically a requirement of childhood. But the dreams felt different from anything I'd experienced before, too detailed and too consistent to dismiss as mere fantasy. And they were changing me. I began to notice things that hadn't bothered me before. The way light fell differently in corners where grandfather had recently stood. How conversations seemed to echo strangely when he was part of them. The fact that mirrors reflected his image with just a moment's delay, as if his presence had to catch up with itself. My appetite disappeared, and dark circles formed beneath my eyes like bruises. My mother attributed this to the summer heat and made concerned noises about getting more vitamins into my diet, but I could see the worry growing behind her cheerful facade. My father worked longer hours, claiming increased responsibilities at the office, though I suspected he was simply avoiding whatever was happening in our house, because something was happening. The very foundation of our normal life was shifting, though I lacked the vocabulary to express what I was experiencing. Reality had developed soft edges, places where the expected gave way to something altogether more unsettling. It was on the 15th night of grandfather's stay that everything reached its crescendo. I had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion, though sleep felt like the last thing my jangling nerves could accommodate. The house had settled into its evening rhythms, dishes clattering in the kitchen as my mother cleaned up from dinner, the distant murmur of the television from the living room where my father watched his nightly news programs. Grandfather's footsteps approached my room with their familiar deliberate cadence, and I closed my eyes, feigning sleep in the hope that he might skip our usual ritual. But the footsteps stopped outside my door, and I heard the soft creak of hinges as he entered. The rocking chair groaned under his weight, and I listened as he opened his book of ghost stories. But instead of reading aloud, he simply sat there in silence, and I could feel his pale eyes boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours, and still he didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Finally, unable to maintain the pretense any longer, I opened my eyes. He was watching me with an expression I had never seen before, something that might have been satisfaction mixed with anticipation. The book lay closed in his lap, and his hands were folded over it with the careful precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. His voice, when he finally spoke, was different, older somehow, as if it was coming from a great distance. He told me that he had something special to share with me, something that would help me understand the stories he'd been reading. His pale eyes never blinked as he spoke, and that strange smell seemed to intensify, filling my nostrils with its cloying sweetness. He rose from the rocking chair and approached my bed with movements that seemed to flow rather than step. The shadows in the room deepened, and I realized that the light from my bedside lamp was growing dimmer, as if something was slowly draining its power. When he leaned down to give me his customary goodnight kiss, his face seemed to change in the failing light, features shifting in ways that made my vision blur and my head swim. His lips, when they touched my forehead, were cold as winter morning and lingered far longer than usual. I felt something pass between us in that moment, not words or breath, but something deeper and more fundamental. Then the light went out completely, and I was alone in perfect darkness. When I woke the next morning, sunshine was streaming through my bedroom windows with an intensity that made me squint and shield my eyes. My mother was shaking my shoulder gently, her face creased with concern. She had been trying to wake me for over an hour, she explained, and had begun to worry that I was ill. Grandfather was nowhere to be seen. My mother's explanation came in careful, measured tones that suggested she had been preparing her words for some time. Grandfather had suffered some kind of episode during the night. Not a heart attack exactly, but something that had required immediate medical attention. He had been taken to the hospital in the early hours of the morning, and the doctors weren't sure when he might be able to return. The guest room next to mine stood empty, its bed neatly made and all traces of his occupation removed. The rocking chair had been returned to its usual position by the window, and the book of ghost stories was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had never been there at all, except for that lingering smell that seemed to have seeped into the very walls. But here is where memory becomes unreliable, where the solid ground of recollection gives way to something far more treacherous. Because I remember my mother telling me about the hospital. I remember the careful way she avoided my eyes when she spoke, the nervous gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear that she always made when she was lying. I remember asking when we could visit him, and the long pause before she told me that wouldn't be possible just yet. But I also remember other things. Things that don't align with that official version of events. I remember hearing my parents arguing in hushed tones late that night, their voices carrying through the thin walls with an urgency that spoke of crisis. I remember my father making phone calls at odd hours, his voice strained and uncertain as he spoke to people whose names I didn't recognize. I remember the way both of them began to watch me with a new kind of attention, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Most of all, I remember the dreams that continued long after grandfather's room stood empty. The vast house with its impossible dimensions was still there when I closed my eyes, still filled with those white-draped shapes and that persistent humming. But now there were new elements. Doors that opened onto starless voids, mirrors that reflected rooms I had never seen, and always, the sensation of being followed by something that had once been human, but was no longer quite the same. The footsteps in the hallway didn't stop either. If anything, they became more frequent, more insistent, accompanied now by that tuneless humming that seemed to vibrate through my bones. My parents, when I mentioned these disturbances, exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge they weren't prepared to discuss. Sleep became a battlefield where I fought nightly against visions that felt more real than my waking hours. I would find myself standing in places I had never been, having conversations with people whose faces I couldn't quite see, experiencing events that left me exhausted and confused when I finally struggled back to consciousness. And through it all, there was the growing certainty that something fundamental had changed during that last night with grandfather, something that couldn't be undone or explained away. The official story, when it finally emerged weeks later, was that grandfather had simply decided to return to his own home. The episode my mother had mentioned turned out to be nothing more serious than fatigue and disorientation, perfectly understandable for a man of his age adjusting to new surroundings. He had recovered quickly and felt more comfortable in familiar environment. But I knew better. I had felt that kiss, cold and lingering, and I had seen the way the shadows moved when he approached my bed. I had experienced the weight of his attention and the strange transformation that had occurred in the failing light of my bedroom lamp. Whatever had happened that night, it wasn't something that could be dismissed with rational explanations and comforting lies. Years passed, and the dreams gradually faded to the point where I could almost convince myself they had been nothing more than the product of an overwrought imagination. I grew up, moved away, built a life that had no room for childhood terrors and unexplained phenomena. But I never forgot that smell. Pipe tobacco and mothballs and something else. Something that made my stomach turn and my skin crawl with remembered dread. And now, standing in this empty house where it all began, I can smell it again. The real estate agent who brought me here claims the house has been vacant for months, but the air is thick with that familiar odor, and I can hear something moving in the rooms above. Slow, deliberate footsteps that pause outside closed doors as if listening for something. The guest room where grandfather stayed still bears the faint impression of weight in the mattress, and the rocking chair by the window moves slightly in the still air, as if recently vacated. On the dresser, barely visible beneath a layer of dust, lies a book of ghost stories that I'm absolutely certain was never left behind. I should leave. Every instinct I possess is screaming at me to turn around and walk away from this place, to pretend I never came here and never saw what I'm seeing now. But I can't seem to make my feet cooperate. Can't seem to break the spell that holds me rooted to the spot where I first learned that some kisses leave marks that never fade. Because I'm beginning to understand that what happened all those years ago wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. And whatever began in that small boy's bedroom on a summer night when the shadows grew too deep and the light failed at exactly the wrong moment is still continuing, still unfolding, still waiting for its proper conclusion. The footsteps above have stopped now, and I can feel that familiar attention settling over me like a heavy blanket. Somewhere in the distance, almost too faint to hear, someone is humming a tuneless melody that makes my bones ache with recognition. I'm not 8 years old anymore, but standing here in this empty house, surrounded by the ghosts of memory and possibility, I feel just as small and vulnerable as I did on that last night when everything changed. And I'm finally beginning to understand that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. Story 12. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was grief playing tricks on my nervous system. Standing beside the freshly turned earth where we'd laid Nana to rest just hours before, my hands suddenly erupted in warmth. Not the surface heat of sun-baked skin or the sting of touching something hot, but a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to flow from my bones outward. The sensation wrapped around my fingers like invisible gloves, gentle and familiar, exactly the way Nana's weathered hands had felt when she'd hold mine during those long afternoons on her porch. The cemetery stretched endlessly in both directions, a rolling landscape of weathered headstones and carefully maintained grass. October wind whispered through the bare branches overhead, carrying the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and something else. Something sweet and floral that reminded me of the lavender sachets Nana kept in her dresser drawers. My black suit felt too tight, the fabric scratching against my neck as I stood there alone, everyone else having returned to their cars after the service. I flexed my fingers experimentally, watching them move in the late afternoon light. The warmth pulsed gently, rhythmic like a heartbeat, and for one impossible moment I could swear I felt pressure there. Not painful, but comforting, like someone was actually holding my hands. The rational part of my mind kicked in immediately. Stress reaction, psychosomatic response to trauma. I'd read about this kind of thing in the medical journals I reviewed for work. People experiencing phantom sensations after losing loved ones, the brain's desperate attempt to process grief through familiar physical memories. Nothing supernatural about it. By the time I reached my car, the sensation had faded completely. 3 days later, it happened again. I was sorting through Nana's belongings in her house, a task I'd been dreading since the funeral. The place still smelled like her, that distinctive mixture of vanilla candles, old books, and the faint medicinal scent of the arthritis cream she'd rubbed on her joints every morning. Her insurance agent had been calling constantly about clearing out the property, and I'd finally forced myself to begin the process. I'd been going through her jewelry box, finding mostly costume pieces and a few items with sentimental value, when I picked up her wedding ring. The simple gold band felt heavier than it should have in my palm, and suddenly the warmth returned to my hands with startling intensity. This time it wasn't just gentle, it was urgent, almost insistent, as if someone was squeezing my fingers in warning. The ring slipped from my grasp and rolled across the hardwood floor, coming to rest beneath her antique vanity. As I knelt to retrieve it, the warmth vanished as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving my hands cold and slightly numb. I sat back on my heels, staring at the ring. The rational explanations were getting harder to accept. Stress doesn't typically manifest in such specific, repeatable patterns, and the timing felt too deliberate, too connected to moments when I was handling Nana's most personal possessions. That night, I found myself researching phantom touch experiences online. diving deep into medical literature and psychological studies. Most sources attributed the phenomenon to grief-induced hallucinations or neurological misfiring caused by trauma. Some discussed how the brain could recreate familiar sensations as a coping mechanism, essentially replaying comforting memories through false sensory input. But none of the clinical descriptions matched what I was experiencing. This didn't feel like a memory or a trick of my nervous system. It felt external, intentional, like genuine communication. I closed my laptop and tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, I could feel that gentle pressure returning to my hands, softer now, almost apologetic, as if she knew I was struggling to understand. The pattern continued over the following weeks, becoming more frequent and more specific. The warmth would appear whenever I encountered certain objects in her house, her favorite teacup, the Afghan she'd been knitting when she passed, the leather-bound photo albums filled with pictures of our family. Each time the sensation felt slightly different, sometimes gentle and reassuring, other times urgent and demanding attention. I started keeping a log, documenting when and where each episode occurred, looking for patterns that might explain what was happening to me. The data revealed something unsettling. The warmth only appeared when I was alone with items that had been particularly meaningful to Nana. Never when others were present, never with random objects, and never outside her house. By the third week, I'd begun to suspect I was losing my mind. The breakthrough came when I was going through her desk, searching for important documents the lawyer needed. Hidden in the back of the bottom drawer, I found a manila envelope marked with my name in Nana's distinctive handwriting. Inside were several photographs I'd never seen before. Pictures of me as a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting beside a woman I didn't recognize. The woman was elderly, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was holding my hand in the photograph, and something about her expression seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have known her. The moment I touched the photographs, the warmth in my hands became so intense it was almost painful. But this time, something else happened. Images flashed through my mind, brief, vivid scenes that felt like memories, but couldn't be mine. A kitchen I'd never seen, filled with the smell of baking bread. A woman's voice singing lullabies in a language I didn't understand. The feeling of small hands being guided to knead dough on a floured countertop. I dropped the photographs and stumbled backward, my heart racing. The warmth disappeared instantly, leaving me feeling strangely hollow, like something essential had been abruptly taken away. That evening I called my father and asked him about the pictures. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke, his voice careful and measured. He told me about his mother's mother, my great-grandmother, who had lived with our family for a few years when I was very young. She'd helped care for me while my parents worked, spending her days teaching me to cook and telling me stories from the old country. She died when I was 8, he said. The trauma of losing her had been so severe that I'd blocked out most of my memories of her. The family had decided it was better not to force me to remember, hoping the grief would fade naturally with time. But looking at the photographs, I could feel those lost memories trying to surface, like objects floating up from the bottom of a deep lake. The woman in the pictures wasn't a stranger. She was the source of my earliest, most comforting associations with being cared for and loved. The implications were staggering. If these episodes weren't related to Nana at all, but to some deeper, forgotten connection with another woman who had loved me. I spent the next several days in Nana's house, surrounded by her belongings, trying to understand what was happening to me. The warmth continued to appear, but now I paid closer attention to its nuances. Sometimes it felt like Nana, gentle, familiar, carrying the memory of afternoon conversations and shared meals. But other times it felt different, older, with undertones I was only beginning to recognize. It was during one of these episodes that I made the most disturbing discovery. I was going through Nana's bedroom closet when I found a small wooden box hidden behind her winter coats. Inside were more photographs, documents, and a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. As I untied the ribbon, the warmth appeared in my hands with unusual intensity, but this time it felt layered, complex, as if multiple people were trying to touch me simultaneously. The letters were correspondence between Nana and various family members, dating back decades. Most discussed mundane family matters. But one letter caught my attention. A conversation between Nana and my father about my great-grandmother's final days. The letter revealed something my father had never told me. My great-grandmother had died in this very house, in the bedroom where I was now standing. Nana had been caring for her mother during those final months, and according to the letter, the elderly woman had become obsessed with the idea that she needed to find a way to continue watching over me after she was gone. She'd spoken constantly about feeling responsible for my well-being, about promises she'd made to my parents to keep me safe. The letter described how, in her final weeks, my great-grandmother had claimed she could feel some kind of connection to me even when we were apart, as if an invisible thread linked us together. The family had attributed this to confusion brought on by medication and illness, but now I wondered if there had been something more to her claims. As I read, the warmth in my hands began to shift and change, becoming more complex, more layered. I could sense multiple presences there. Nana's familiar touch, but also something else, something older and more intense. The sensation was overwhelming, like being embraced by invisible arms that held generations of love and worry and desperate need to protect. The room grew cold around me despite the warmth in my hands, and I became aware of a presence watching me from somewhere beyond my peripheral vision. Not threatening, but intense, as if someone was studying me with fierce concentration. The air felt thick, charged with energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I set the letters aside and looked around the room, searching for the source of the sensation. Everything appeared normal. The same furniture, the same faded wallpaper, the same afternoon light filtering through the curtains. But something had changed in the atmosphere, something fundamental that I couldn't quite identify. That's when I noticed the temperature differential. While my hands blazed with warmth, the rest of the room had become noticeably cold. Not winter cold, but the kind of chill that seems to come from inside your bones, as if the warmth in my hands was drawing heat from everything else around me. The contrast was becoming more pronounced with each passing moment, and I realized with growing unease that this physical impossibility couldn't be explained by any rational means. I tried to pull my hands apart, to break whatever connection was causing the warmth, but found I couldn't move them. Not because they were restrained, but because moving them felt wrong, like interrupting something crucial that needed to continue. The warmth pulsed with increasing urgency, and with it came a growing sense that someone was trying to communicate something vital, something I wasn't yet understanding. The presence in the room grew stronger, more insistent. I could feel attention focused on me with laser-like intensity, as if invisible eyes were studying every detail of my face, my posture, my reactions. The sensation was simultaneously comforting and deeply unsettling, like being loved so fiercely that it bordered on possession. Images began flashing through my mind again, clearer this time. I saw myself as a child, but from an external perspective, as if someone else was watching me play, eat, sleep. I saw moments of danger I barely remembered, nearly falling downstairs, reaching toward a hot stove, wandering too close to a busy street. In each scene, I was guided away from harm by hands I couldn't see, protected by someone who was always watching, always vigilant. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had never been alone. Not during childhood, not during the difficult years of adolescence, not during any of the challenging moments of my adult life. Someone had been there, invisible but present, guiding me away from harm, offering comfort in moments of distress. The warmth in my hands wasn't random. It was a sign, a signal that this protection was still active, still working. But protection from what? The question had barely formed in my mind when the warmth in my hands suddenly shifted, becoming urgent, almost frantic. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, and I became aware of a new presence, something that felt fundamentally different from the loving attention I'd been sensing. This was cold, hungry, searching. It moved through the house like smoke, probing, testing, looking for something specific, looking for me. The warm presence in my hands responded immediately, becoming defensive, wrapping around me like an invisible shield. I could feel the conflict between these two forces, one trying to reach me, the other working desperately to keep it away. The battle was silent but intense, fought with energies I couldn't see but somehow felt with every nerve in my body. My hands began to burn with heat so intense it was almost painful, but I found I still couldn't move them. The warmth was no longer just comfort. It was armor, protection against something that wanted to touch me in ways that would not be gentle or loving. Through the window, I could see the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows across the bedroom floor. But the shadows seemed wrong, too dark, moving in ways that didn't match the shifting light. One shadow in particular caught my attention. It seemed to be reaching toward me across the floor, stretching longer than any normal shadow should be able to extend. The protective warmth in my hands pulsed frantically, and suddenly I understood. Whatever had been watching over me wasn't trying to comfort me now. It was trying to warn me. The coldness in the room, the searching presence, the shadow reaching across the floor. Something else had found me here. Something that had been looking for me for a very long time. And the woman who had promised to protect me, who had maintained her vigil even after death, was running out of strength to keep it away. The shadow touched my foot, and immediately I felt a different kind of cold. Not the absence of warmth, but the active presence of something that consumed heat, that fed on the energy of living things. It began to climb my leg, bringing with it a hunger so vast and patient that I could barely comprehend it. The warmth in my hands flared one final time, burning so hot I thought my skin might blister, and then began to fade. Not gradually, but quickly, as if whatever force had been sustaining it was being drained away. I could feel the protective presence weakening, its attention scattered, its ability to maintain the shield around me failing. As the last of the warmth disappeared from my hands, the cold presence reached my chest, and I finally understood what it wanted. Not to harm me, that would be too simple. It wanted to replace what I was losing, to become the new constant presence in my life, to be the one watching, guiding, touching me with invisible hands. But its version of protection would not be gentle or loving. It would be possessive, controlling, hungry for the warmth it could steal from my living flesh. In the growing darkness of the bedroom, I felt the last traces of my great-grandmother's presence fade away completely. Her strength finally exhausted by decades of vigilant protection. The battle was over, and I was alone with whatever had been hunting me all these years, waiting for the moment when my guardian's strength would finally fail. The cold presence settled around me like a blanket, and new hands that felt nothing like the loving touch I'd grown accustomed to, began to wrap around my fingers. They were just as warm as Nana's had been, just as gentle, just as impossible to resist. And as I stood there in the darkening room, feeling this new warmth spread through my hands and up my arms, I couldn't tell anymore whether I was being protected or consumed, whether the love I felt was real, or merely the hunger of something that had learned to imitate the touch of those who had truly cared for me. The warmth continued to spread, and I realized with growing horror that I no longer wanted it to stop, that I was beginning to need it, that I might already be lost to whatever had been waiting so patiently for this moment, when my true protector could no longer stand between us. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and I remained in the bedroom, alone with the warmth that felt so much like love, but carried the cold of eternity within it, wondering if I would ever be able to tell the difference again. Story 13. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric hymn as I walked down the sterile corridor, my footsteps echoing against polished linoleum that reflected everything in warped, distorted shapes. 3 weeks had passed since the accident, and every evening I made this same pilgrimage through the maze of antiseptic hallways to room 314, where my wife lay suspended in that terrible space between waking and whatever lay beyond. The Mercy General ICU operated with the mechanical precision of a Swiss watch after sunset. Nurses moved like ghosts in their soft-soled shoes, their voices reduced to whispers that seemed to carry farther than they should in the hushed atmosphere. Monitors beeped their rhythmic assurances of life continuing, while the ventilator beside my wife's bed maintained its steady, artificial breathing that had become the soundtrack to my sleepless nights. I'd grown accustomed to the routine. The evening shift supervisor, a stern woman with steel gray hair, would nod as I passed the nurses' station. The same 3 nurses rotated their rounds with clockwork regularity. The janitor would shuffle by at precisely 9:30, mopping the floors with disinfectant that burned my nostrils. Everything followed its prescribed pattern, a comfort in the chaos that had become my life. But that Tuesday night, something felt different. The usual supervisor wasn't at her post. Instead, a younger woman I'd never seen before sat behind the curved desk, her dark hair pulled back severely, her pale hands moving across paperwork with an almost hypnotic rhythm. She looked up as I approached, and her eyes, an unusual shade of gray that seemed to shift in the artificial light, fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Room 314, I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. I'd learned that speaking minimally was the most efficient way to navigate these interactions. She tilted her head slightly, studying me as if I were a specimen under glass. Visiting hours ended at 8. The clock on the wall read 8:47. I'd been coming here for weeks, always arriving after 8, and no one had ever questioned it. The evening staff knew me, understood that these late hours were when I could steal moments with my wife without the bustle of day shift activity, without well-meaning doctors explaining things I already knew too well. The night supervisor always lets me stay until 10, I explained, feeling an odd need to justify myself to this stranger. Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but it never reached her eyes. That's unusual. Hospital policy is quite clear about visiting hours. She paused, her fingers drumming silently against the desk. But perhaps an exception could be made for someone saying goodbye. The word hung between us like a physical thing. Goodbye. As if she knew something I didn't, as if the machines keeping my wife tethered to this world had whispered secrets to her during her shift. "She's not dying," I said, the words coming out sharper than intended. "She's stable," the doctor said. "Of course." The nurse's voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something underneath it that made my teeth ache. "Go ahead, Mr. Holloway, room 314. I hadn't told her my name. The walk to my wife's room felt longer than usual, the corridor stretching ahead of me like a tunnel that led somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. The familiar sounds of the ICU seemed muted, as if heard through water. Even my footsteps sounded different, hollow, echoing in a way that suggested vast, empty spaces beyond the walls. My wife lay as she had for 3 weeks, surrounded by the mechanical orchestra that kept her alive. The ventilator's rhythm, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the soft hiss of oxygen flowing through clear plastic tubes. Her face, once animated by laughter and quick wit, had taken on the waxy stillness of a museum piece. The swelling from the accident had gone down, revealing features that were familiar yet somehow foreign, as if sleep had transformed her into a distant cousin of herself. I settled into the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, a piece of furniture designed by someone who clearly believed that comfort encouraged longer visits. The vinyl cushion exhaled a small sigh as it compressed under my weight, and I reached for her hand. Still warm, still soft, but eerily limp. That's when I noticed the nurse standing in the doorway. She wasn't the same woman from the front desk. This one was older, with silver hair that caught the light from the hallway, and a uniform that seemed somehow different from the others I'd seen. Crisp and white, but cut in a style that looked almost vintage. She watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read, her head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "She's beautiful," the nurse said, stepping into the room with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. "Even like this, you can see the person she was." Her voice carried an accent I couldn't place, something that spoke of distant places and older times. She moved to the opposite side of the bed, her eyes never leaving my wife's face. "You're new," I said. It wasn't really a question. In a way. She reached out and touched my wife's forehead with fingers that seemed to barely make contact. Sometimes we're called to help with transitions, when someone needs to move from one place to another. The word transition sent ice through my veins. "She's not dying. The doctors haven't said anything about..." Not that kind of transition. The nurse's smile was gentle, but her eyes held depths that suggested she'd witnessed things beyond the scope of normal human experience. Sometimes people get lost between worlds. Sometimes they need permission to find their way. She moved around the bed toward me, her steps silent on the linoleum floor. She's waiting for something. Can you feel it? I wanted to deny it, but the truth was that I could feel something. For days now, sitting beside this bed, I'd sensed a kind of tension in the air, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Sometimes I caught myself looking over my shoulder, certain someone was watching from the doorway, only to find empty space. What kind of permission? I heard myself ask. The kind only you can give. She was close enough now that I could smell her perfume, something floral and old-fashioned that reminded me of my grandmother's garden. She needs to know it's okay to let go, or to come back. Right now, she's suspended between choices. The monitors continued their electronic chorus, but somehow they seemed fainter, as if the machinery was losing its grip on the woman lying between the crisp white sheets. The nurse reached across and touched my hand, her fingers cool and surprisingly strong. "Talk to her," she said. "Tell her what you need her to know." For the next hour, I did something I hadn't been able to do since the accident. I spoke to my wife. Really spoke to her. Not just the one-sided conversations about my day or the weather, or the things happening in the world outside these walls. I told her about the future we'd planned, the dreams we'd shared, the life that waited for her if she chose to come back to it. I also told her that if the choice was too difficult, if the pull toward whatever lay beyond was stronger than the tether to this world, I would understand. The nurse stood silently throughout, sometimes touching my wife's hand, sometimes mine, her presence somehow making the words easier to find. When I finally fell silent, emotionally drained and hollow, she nodded as if something had been accomplished. "That's what she needed to hear," she said. "Now the choice is hers." She moved toward the door, her footsteps still eerily silent. Just before she reached the threshold, I called out to her, "What's your name?" She turned back, and for a moment her face seemed to shimmer in the fluorescent light, as if I were seeing her through heat waves. "Does it matter?" Before I could answer, she was gone. I sat in the chair until nearly midnight, watching my wife's face for any sign of change, any indication that my words had reached her in whatever distant place her consciousness had traveled. The monitors maintained their steady rhythm, and her breathing continued with mechanical precision. But something felt different. The tension I'd sensed for weeks seemed to have dissipated, as if a decision had been made somewhere beyond the reach of machines and medicine. When I finally left the room, the ICU was quiet except for the usual symphony of electronic life support. The nurse's station was empty except for a different supervisor, a man I recognized from previous visits who nodded at me with professional courtesy. "How is she tonight?" he asked, his voice pitched low to avoid disturbing other patients. "The same," I said, then hesitated. The nurse who was here earlier, the older woman with silver hair, she was very helpful. His brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry, but there's no one on tonight's staff matching that description. Are you sure you didn't speak with one of the day shift nurses before you left?" "No, she was definitely here. She was in my wife's room around 9:30, 10 o'clock. He pulled up something on his computer screen, scrolling through what I assumed was staffing information. "I've been here since 7, and I know everyone working tonight. There's no one on this floor who fits that description." The ice that had touched my spine earlier returned with vengeance. "That's impossible." I spoke with her for over an hour. "Maybe you dozed off," he suggested gently. "It happens more often than you'd think. The stress, the late hours. Sometimes our minds fill in gaps in ways that seem completely real." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd experienced was authentic, but doubt began to creep in like cold water through a crack in a dam. Had I imagined the entire encounter? Had grief and exhaustion finally caught up with me, creating elaborate hallucinations to help me process the impossible situation? But her perfume, I could still smell traces of that floral scent on my clothes. The drive home took place in a haze of confusion and growing dread. Every traffic light seemed to last forever, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror repeatedly, certain I was being followed despite the empty streets. The radio played static-filled late-night talk shows that seemed to discuss my situation in coded language, their words just unclear enough to maintain plausible deniability. By the time I reached my empty house, I'd almost convinced myself that the supervisor was right. Stress could create remarkably vivid hallucinations. The mind was capable of extraordinary self-deception when faced with unbearable circumstances. Perhaps I'd simply fallen asleep in the chair and dreamed the entire encounter. But sleep eluded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the nurse's gray eyes and felt the cool touch of her fingers. Her words echoed in my memory with a clarity that seemed inconsistent with a dream. And underneath it all was the nagging certainty that something fundamental had changed in that hospital room. Some cosmic gear had shifted into a new position. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. "Mr. Holloway?" The voice was crisp, professional, tinged with the kind of careful neutrality that medical personnel used when delivering significant news. "This is Dr. Patterson at Mercy General. I need you to come in immediately." My heart hammered against my ribs as I threw on clothes and raced through empty streets back to the hospital. The ICU buzzed with unusual activity for the early morning hours, nurses moving with purpose, doctors huddled in serious consultation. Dr. Patterson met me at the elevator, her face unreadable. "There's been a change," she said as we walked toward room 314. "Around midnight, your wife's neurological responses began showing significant improvement, brain activity that we haven't seen since the accident." We reached the room, and I could see immediately that something was different. The same machine surrounded my wife's bed, but the quality of her stillness had changed. Instead of the waxy immobility that had characterized her coma, she seemed to be sleeping naturally, her facial muscles occasionally twitching with what looked like dreams. "We're cautiously optimistic," Dr. Patterson continued. "These kinds of sudden improvements aren't unheard of, but they're unusual. We're running additional tests, but initial indicators suggest she may be emerging from the coma." As she spoke, I watched my wife's eyelids flutter. Her fingers, which had been limp for 3 weeks, curled slightly as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. "Did anything unusual happen during your visit last night?" the doctor asked. "Sometimes external stimuli can trigger neurological responses." I thought about the mysterious nurse, about the conversation that may or may not have taken place, about words of permission spoken in a room that might have been empty, except for my own fractured psyche. "No," I said, "nothing unusual." But even as I spoke the lie, I caught a faint trace of floral perfume lingering in the air around my wife's bed, the same scent I'd noticed on my clothes hours earlier. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure in white moving past the doorway, silver hair catching the light before disappearing around the corner. Dr. Patterson didn't seem to notice. She continued explaining the medical procedures they would implement, the cautious optimism that needed to be tempered with realistic expectations, the long road of recovery that might lie ahead. But her words faded into background noise as I focused on my wife's face, watching for signs of the consciousness that seemed to be swimming closer to the surface. Over the following days, my wife's condition continued to improve with a speed that surprised even the most experienced neurologists. She began responding to external stimuli, her eyes tracking movement, her hand squeezing mine with increasing strength. The medical team spoke of miracles and remarkable recoveries, using words like unprecedented and extraordinary to describe her progress. But I couldn't shake the memory of that night, the conversation with a nurse who may or may not have existed. Sometimes, in the quiet moments sitting beside my wife's bed, I found myself looking toward the doorway, half expecting to see that familiar figure watching from the shadows. The logical part of my mind insisted that stress and exhaustion had created an elaborate hallucination, that my wife's recovery was simply the unpredictable nature of brain trauma playing out in our favor. Yet doubt gnawed at me like a persistent ache. The perfume I'd smelled, the specific details of our conversation, the timing of my wife's improvement immediately following that mysterious encounter. These elements felt too substantial, too interconnected to dismiss as products of an overwrought imagination. 3 weeks after the incident with the nurse, my wife opened her eyes and spoke her first word since the accident. My name, whispered with a voice raw from weeks of mechanical ventilation. As tears ran down my cheeks and I called for the medical team, I caught another glimpse of movement in the doorway, a flash of white that might have been a uniform, a brief outline that could have been silver hair. But when I looked directly, the space was empty except for the excited bustle of doctors and nurses responding to the miraculous moment of awakening. No one else seemed to notice anything unusual, and I didn't mention what I thought I'd seen. My wife's recovery progressed with remarkable speed. Within days, she was breathing on her own. Within weeks, she was sitting up, engaging in simple conversations, slowly reclaiming the personality that had been lost in the mechanical limbo of the coma. The medical team remained baffled by the sudden turnaround, but focused on the positive outcomes rather than the inexplicable nature of her improvement. During one of our first real conversations, as she struggled to piece together the lost weeks of her memory, my wife mentioned a dream she'd had while unconscious. "There was a woman," she said, her voice still weak but growing stronger each day. "An older woman with kind eyes. She told me I had a choice to make, that someone was waiting for me to decide. She said you'd given me permission to choose." My blood turned to ice water. What did she look like? Silver hair, old-fashioned uniform. She smelled like flowers. My wife's eyes searched mine, looking for recognition. It felt so real, like she was actually there in the room with us. Was there a nurse like that? I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. What could I say? That I'd had the same encounter with someone who apparently didn't exist. That the hospital staff insisted no such person worked there. That I'd begun to question my own sanity during the weeks of her recovery. Instead, I took her hand and smiled. What matters is that you're here. You chose to come back. She squeezed my fingers with strength that increased daily. I almost didn't. It was so peaceful where I was, so quiet. But she helped me understand that some choices are too important to make alone. Months have passed since that night, and my wife has made a complete recovery that continues to amaze her medical team. We've returned to something resembling our normal life, though neither of us discusses the mysterious nurse who may or may not have facilitated her return to consciousness. But sometimes in the early morning hours when the world is quiet and shadows play tricks with perception, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A flash of white in an empty hallway. The scent of flowers when none are present. The sense of being watched by eyes that hold depths of experience beyond normal human understanding. I've never been able to determine whether the nurse was real or a product of psychological stress pushed beyond its breaking point. Perhaps the distinction doesn't matter. Perhaps in those liminal spaces where life and death negotiate their boundaries, reality becomes more fluid, more susceptible to the intervention of forces that operate according to different rules. What I know for certain is that my wife returned from a place where many don't, and her recovery coincided with an encounter that defied logical explanation. Whether that encounter was supernatural intervention or the elaborate construction of a mind-seeking meaning in chaos, it served its purpose. Sometimes late at night, when I'm walking through hospital corridors visiting other patients in need of hope, I find myself looking for silver hair and kind eyes. Not because I want answers to questions that may not have solutions, but because I've learned that some mysteries are more valuable than explanations. And occasionally, just occasionally, I catch a glimpse of white moving through the shadows. And I know that somewhere in the space between worlds, there are still those who help lost souls find their way home. Story 14. The rope hung like a judgment from the old Douglas fir, creaking with each breath of wind that swept through the cathedral of pines. 23 years I'd been walking these trails, and I thought I'd seen everything the forest could offer up. Dead hikers who'd lost their way. Hunters who'd mistaken their own shadows for prey. Even that time when the avalanche took half the mountain and left behind a graveyard of splintered trees and silence. But this was different. The body had been removed 3 days ago. Some poor soul who'd decided the weight of the world was too much to carry. The rope remained, though, Standard procedure would have been to cut it down, bag it as evidence, clear the scene. But something about that particular spot made my skin crawl, made me turn away each time I approached with my utility knife. The way the shadows fell wrong beneath that tree. The way the air seemed thicker there, like breathing through wet cotton. So the rope stayed, swaying in the mountain breeze, marking a place where something had gone terribly wrong. That was Tuesday. Wednesday brought the first set of clothes. I almost missed them, would have walked right past if not for the unnatural way the fabric caught the morning light. Folded neat as Sunday laundry, placed on a flat boulder maybe 50 yards from the hanging tree. Small clothes, a tiny pair of jeans, edges creased sharp enough to cut paper, a miniature t-shirt with some cartoon character I couldn't identify, colors still bright despite the mountain dew that should have faded them. Underneath, socks rolled into perfect balls and underwear that looked like it had never been worn. My radio crackled to life before I could process what I was seeing. Dispatch calling about a lost dog near the North Trail. I stuffed the clothes into an evidence bag, told myself I'd file a report later, and spent the rest of the day chasing false leads through brambles that tore at my uniform and left me bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts. That night, alone in my cabin, I spread the clothes across my kitchen table and stared at them under the harsh fluorescent light. They were clean. Too clean. No dirt. No wear. No smell of the outdoors that should have clung to anything left in the forest overnight. The fabric felt wrong beneath my fingers, too soft, like it had been washed in something other than detergent. I told myself it was nothing, probably some hiker's laundry that had blown away from a campsite. Kids lose clothes all the time, leave them behind at rest stops and picnic areas. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Thursday proved me wrong. More clothes, this time arranged on a different boulder, deeper in the pines where the canopy grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. Another perfect set, folded with military precision. Pants, shirt, underwear, socks. All small, all clean, all wrong. I stood there in the green-filtered half-light, listening to the whisper of wind through needle-heavy branches, and felt something watching me. Not the familiar presence of forest animals. I knew the weight of deer eyes, the curious gaze of squirrels, the distant observation of circling hawks. This was different, patient, calculating. When I turned to scan the tree line, nothing moved, but the feeling remained, pressing against my back like cold fingers. That evening I called my supervisor, tried to explain what I'd found without sounding like I'd lost my mind. He listened with the kind of patience reserved for old employees who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. Could be connected to the suicide, he said finally. People do strange things when they're planning to, maybe this person had some kind of ritual, some way of saying goodbye to childhood or innocence or whatever. It made sense. It had to make sense. But it didn't explain the pristine condition of the clothes, or why they kept appearing days after the body had been found and removed. Friday brought shoes, tiny sneakers, laces tied in perfect bows, placed side by side on a moss-covered log like someone had just stepped out of them. The rubber soles were unmarked, white as fresh snow. When I picked them up, they were warm. Not sun warm, not heat from the ground warm, body warm. As if someone had been wearing them moments before I arrived, I dropped them immediately, the sound of their impact unnaturally loud in the forest quiet. They landed upright, still perfectly positioned, still radiating that impossible warmth. The watching feeling had grown stronger. Whatever observed me from the shadows no longer bothered to hide its presence. I could feel it moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped, always just outside my peripheral vision. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath. Saturday brought 2 sets of everything, 2 perfectly folded outfits, 2 pairs of shoes, arranged on either side of the trail like some invisible children had decided to play in the dirt and would be back any moment to reclaim their things. I began to understand that this wasn't random. The placement was deliberate, leading me deeper into the forest with each discovery, away from the main trails, away from the marked paths that weekend hikers used, into the heart of the pines where the trees grew so close together that the ground between them lay in perpetual shadow. The rope still hung from its tree, but I could no longer see it from where the trail had led me. Everything looked the same in this deep forest, endless columns of bark stretching up toward a canopy so thick it filtered out the sky. I had my GPS, my radio, my years of experience navigating these mountains. But for the first time since becoming a ranger, I felt lost. That's when I heard the laughter, high and bright, like wind chimes made of crystal. It echoed through the trees from no direction and every direction at once. Children's laughter, full of joy and innocence, and something that made my blood freeze in my veins. When I called out, asking if anyone was there, if anyone needed help, the laughter stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a slap. But in that silence, I heard something else. Footsteps, light as falling leaves but unmistakably real, moving through the forest parallel to where I stood. I followed the sound, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to grab at my clothes and skin. But the footsteps always stayed just ahead of me, just out of sight. When I finally stopped, chest heaving, sweat stinging my eyes, I found myself in a small clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood another Douglas fir, its trunk scarred by something that might have been lightning or might have been claws. Arranged in a perfect circle around its base were dozens of sets of clothes, dozens of pairs of shoes, all small, all clean, all waiting. And hanging from the lowest branch, swaying gently in the windless air, was a rope. Not the same rope from Tuesday. This one was different, older, more weathered, its fibers darkened with age and something that might have been stains. It creaked with each gentle movement, and in that creaking I heard voices, whispers, promises of peace and an end to questioning and doubt. I understood then that I had been led here, that the clothes, the shoes, the laughter, the footsteps, all of it had been designed to bring me to this place, to this tree, to this rope. The watching presence was no longer hiding. I could feel it circling the clearing, staying just within the tree line where the shadows lay thick as tar. Whatever it was patient. It had been patient for a very long time, patient enough to fold clothes with perfect precision, patient enough to arrange shoes in neat rows, patient enough to wait for the right person to follow its breadcrumb trail into the deep forest. My radio was dead. Had been dead, I realized, since Thursday. The static I thought I'd been hearing was something else entirely. My GPS showed nothing but blinking question marks. According to the satellite, I was nowhere at all. The rope swayed, and in its movement I saw myself, saw the weight of 23 years walking these trails, finding bodies, cleaning up after human tragedy, carrying the accumulated sorrow of 1,000 small deaths. Saw how easy it would be to simply add my own weight to the branch, to stop asking questions that had no answers, to join whatever waited in the shadows between the trees. But as I stepped closer to the scarred trunk, something caught my eye. Mixed in with the perfectly folded children's clothes were other things. Adult clothes, ranger uniforms, name tags I recognized from personnel files of officers who had simply disappeared over the years, vanished without a trace, their last radio calls fading into static, their vehicles found empty at trailheads with no sign of struggle. The watching presence pressed closer, and I realized it was not one thing but many. All the lost, all the taken, all those who had followed trails of breadcrumbs into the deep forest and found something waiting that was older than the trees, older than the mountains themselves, something that fed on sorrow and hopelessness, and the particular despair that comes with being alone in vast, indifferent wilderness. The rope hanging from the branch was not an invitation, it was a tool, and the small clothes arranged in their perfect circle were not evidence of tragedy. They were bait. I ran, through undergrowth that tore at my skin, through shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers, through air that grew thicker with each step. Behind me, the laughter returned, but different now. Not the innocent joy of children at play, but something ancient and hungry, something that had been perfecting its mimicry for decades. The forest around me began to change. Trees I had known for years took on unfamiliar shapes. Trails I could walk blindfolded twisted into configurations that made no sense. The rope-scarred clearing followed me, appearing around every turn, waiting behind every grove of pines. No matter which direction I ran, I found myself circling back to the place where dozens of sets of clothes waited in their perfect arrangements. On the fifth circuit, or was it the sixth, I stopped running. The watching presence had grown so strong that it felt like drowning in attention. Whatever dwelt in the deep forest had tired of the chase. It pressed close now, close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck, could hear it whispering promises in a language that predated words. But in that moment of surrender, my hand found the utility knife on my belt. The same knife I had been unable to use on the original rope, the one that still swayed beneath the Douglas fir, where all of this had started. My fingers closed around the handle, and I understood what I had to do, not to harm whatever waited in the shadows. You cannot cut shadow with steel, cannot wound hunger with sharpened metal, but to break the pattern, to refuse the role I had been guided to play. I began cutting down the clothes, slashing through fabric that released sounds like screams when the blade parted the fibers, scattering the perfect arrangements into chaos, destroying the careful order that had been designed to lead me to despair. With each cut, the presence in the shadows recoiled. With each destroyed piece of bait, the forest began to reassert its familiar shapes. The laughter turned to something like rage, like a child's tantrum magnified beyond all reason. But it was fading, growing distant, retreating to whatever deep places it had emerged from. When the last set of clothes lay in tatters around the scarred tree, when the last perfect fold had been reduced to scattered threads, the rope simply wasn't there anymore. The clearing began to fade at the edges, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Within moments, I stood in familiar forest again, surrounded by trees I recognized, breathing air that tasted of pine needles and morning dew instead of patient hunger. My radio crackled to life, dispatch asking for my location check. My GPS showed coordinates that made sense, placed me exactly where I should be according to my planned patrol route. But in my pocket, my fingers found a single thread of fabric. Impossibly clean, impossibly soft, still warm with body heat that could not be explained. I never filed a report about the clothes or the shoes, never mentioned the clearing or the watching presence or the sound of children's laughter in places where no children played. Who would believe such things? Who would not question my fitness for duty, my mental stability, my ability to distinguish between reality and the fevered imaginings of a man who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness? Instead, I began to research. Old reports, missing persons files, unexplained disappearances dating back to when the first settlers entered these mountains. I found patterns, cycles, stories of rangers who had walked into the forest and simply vanished, leaving behind only empty uniforms and unanswered questions. And sometimes late at night when the wind blows through the pines with just the right cadence, I hear laughter in the distance, high and bright and patient. I feel eyes watching from the shadows between the trees. I remember the weight of that rope, the promise it carried, the ease with which one could simply step forward and let gravity solve all of life's complicated problems. The original rope still hangs from its tree. I pass it every day on my patrol, and every day I feel the same crawling sensation, the same wrongness that makes me turn away before I can raise my knife to cut it down. Because I understand now that some things are meant to remain, some markers should not be moved. Some invitations should hang forever unanswered, serving as warnings to those who might otherwise follow breadcrumb trails into the deep forest. The clothes have not returned. The shoes remain absent from their moss-covered logs. But the watching never stops. And in my pocket, that single thread of fabric has begun to multiply. 1 became 2. 2 became 4. Each morning I find more, perfectly clean, impossibly soft, warm with the heat of bodies that were never there. Soon, I think, I will have enough for a complete set. Small clothes, folded neat as Sunday laundry. And when that day comes, when the pattern completes itself, I suspect I will understand what the presence in the shadows has been waiting for all along. Until then, I walk my trails. I file my reports. I pretend that the forest holds nothing more dangerous than bears and bad weather. But late at night, when sleep refuses to come, I count the threads in my pocket and wonder if 23 years of walking these mountains has finally driven me to see things that are not there. or if the things I see are more real than I ever dared imagine. The rope creaks in the wind, the shadows watch, and somewhere in the deep forest, something waits with the patience of stone, the hunger of winter, and the perfect memory of every soul who has ever chosen to step forward instead of turning away. The thread count in my pocket has reached 11,